As such, James had spent some resources to place about a dozen or so toilets throughout the city in some of the buildings. Then he had activated his special mob types, selected his glorious toilet mimics, and placed them in a single one. Thanks to their ability Mischievous Mimic, the toilet mimic he spawned was randomly swapping places with other toilets. Because of this, when No More had gone searching the houses away from the party, as rogues tend to do, the poor adventurer had stumbled upon his brand new toilet mimic in all of its porcelain glory. And, as it seemed the mimics on the floor were prone to do, it was much higher level than the ordinary mobs, meaning it made a quick, tasty snack of the poor assassin. I mean, did you really think I wouldn't? James waved his tentacles in the air in a shrug and turned back to chat. Yep, once again, his dungeon's antics were causing quite the stir. Almighty Hammer. Did he just get an achievement involving a toilet mimic? Llama. That's just shitty. Why'd it have to be the rogue? Blaster 2000. Dude, it's always the rogue. Freaking never trust one to stick with the party. Zine Killer. Forget that, man. Toilet mimic. WTF? Tire Harder. Legit, we want the replay. Noob Slayer 42. Yeah, why wasn't Glyax watching the freaking toilet? Screw the raptor. I want to see someone get eaten by a toilet. QQ More. Screw all of that. I want Glyax's dungeon. How does he get all this cool shit? My flame mobs seem boring now. FML. Yup, James had originally started to gain some of his fame from his mimic shenanigans, and it seemed that trend was going to continue. Of course, he fully intended to replay this footage later on so that he could capture the sweet moment No More got flushed. Thanks to the rogue's death and the achievement, James had just netted a nice 4,700 XP. Not bad for a single death. It also meant the party would need to stick around for a few minutes until the assassin was revived. At least it was the rogue that died, since the gnome probably had the best chance of making it all the way back to the town without being picked off by the raptor pack still roaming around in the grass. Some had entered the city, but a few were still waiting patiently for more prey. What the hell is going? Scar's cry brought James from his musings back to the house where No More had been slain. Sure enough, a glowing orb was sitting just in front of an innocent-looking, broken-down toilet. Inside of the room, the other 9 party members, slightly cramped in the room, stared, dumbstruck. The honey badger at Z's side was growling something fierce at the toilet. Did No More shit himself to death? Trold chuckled for a moment at his joke before being elbowed by Olivia. The rest of the group took in the room, all eyes returning to look at the toilet. I think... Z started to draw back his bow before stopping, staring at the toilet, lost in thought. I think that toilet might be a mimic. Hearing it out loud just made the whole situation even more ridiculous. Here they were, a raid party, heading to fight a giant steampunk T-Rex, and yet they were staring, dumbfounded, at a toilet. Well, there was always the test. Oak was grinning again as he opened his mouth once more. That grin, James had come to find, usually meant the warrior was about to do something the rest of the party would view as stupid. Tell me why. There was silence from the entire room for a moment before... Ain't nothing but a heartache. Medic's mumbled sing-song came out, causing the rest of Z's party to start singing along to a song James had never heard. Neither had Scar's party, it seemed, as they were staring at Z's group like they had lost their mind. After a few moments of terrible singing, Manly the dwarf cleared his throat, stepping closer to No More's orb, axes raised. I'm sure your terrible singing is going to debuff it, but I figure my axes will do a better job killing it. He started to take another step forward, readying himself, before No More's voice piped up from the orb. Don't do it! The rogue orb shouted. Thing one-shotted me! The rogue's statement caused everyone to stiffen, and Manly, in a very unmanly fashion, stumbled backwards, away from the porcelain predator. It was, of course, true. James had noticed Mimic seemed to be quite high-leveled compared to the normal mobs on the floor. After all, his first floor had level 20 Mimics with level 10 mobs. His second floor saw the Mimics at level 40. Not as fierce as the perfect Cognivore, but still strong enough to one-shot an unsuspecting rogue. Z cleared his throat, glancing around at the party. How about we go back to hunting down BLU while no more respawns? The rest of the raid party nodded and began heading out the door. As they exited, Z stayed behind for a moment, staring down at the poor rogue's orb. How about next time you don't split the party? His voice was stern, his humor gone. We are here with a purpose. After the Terminus is dead, you can explore all you want. Till then, stick with the group and stick to the plan. Z turned to leave, pausing only once to glance over his shoulder. Your party has the chance to become great, but only if you all work together and don't go off on your own. As Z left the building to rejoin the raid party, James couldn't help but feel emotion well up within him. Z was the exact opposite of X-Ray. Z was a type of gamer, the type of person James wanted to be. Chapter 76. Once No More was able to catch back up to the group, which to James, Rue, and the stream's amusement took the assassin 3 tries, the rest of the raid went rather smoothly. Well, as smoothly as it could in a post-apocalyptic city that seemed to have countless falling dangers, more so than there had been before, and the occasional explosive traps that might have seemed like innocent gas leaks or electrical outages. James had obviously prepared for this. Not to wipe the party, but to whittle them down a little. It was only fair if they were going to be taking on the Terminus with a raid party after all. Besides, he'd been hoping for 1 or 2 accidental deaths early on to capitalize on his experience gain. And while, other than No More, there hadn't been any more deaths, the party was showing signs of wear and tear. Not game-wise, mind you, but physically and mentally. The fights, the constant tense atmosphere, the thought of the upcoming battle, it was all getting to them. Plus, they could tell the floor had gotten harder, which meant to the experienced gamers, there was a chance the boss was much more difficult than before. And that meant the risk of losing all their experience towards their next level was higher. As the raid leader, Z was surely feeling the weight of the party's success on his shoulders, though the Elven Ranger showed it little. James, after having watched this particular adventurer for 2 weeks' worth of immersion, could notice it, though. His smile didn't quite reach as high as it normally did, and his eyes seemed more focused, more intent than normal. Man, what's the drop rate on that thing? Scar was kicking BLU's tail, angrily staring down at it. The chainsword was one of BLU's rarest drops, the only drop rarer being a pet version of BLU. So it was easy to point out that Oak had gotten extremely lucky getting his sword. And it also meant Scar's party was going to have a lot more farming to do if they wanted that very same weapon, because James doubted Oak would part with it. Between Oak's shield and chainsword, the tank was wearing probably the most expensive set of gear out of any player in the game so far, which was only fitting since he was also one of the few off-tanks that was successful. You'll get one eventually, I'm sure. Oak was glancing over his gear as the party waited for everyone's health to respawn. Z had even broken out a campfire and was hard at work cooking up some Dickon meat for the team to give them additional buffs for the Terminus fight. Probably when it's obsolete. Trolls grinned at Scar, and the Death Knight shot the troll a scowl. When James had said everyone seemed worn, he meant everyone but trolled. That freaking hunter seemed unfazed by anything, and James was starting to wonder just how dense he was. Either that, or he really was just a giant troll. Knowing gamers, James guessed it could be the second part. Keep that up and I might forget to tank for you. Then we can see who is obsolete. Scar's comment made the troll wince, and everyone let out a chuckle. Gamers, especially those who raided in MMOs, were resilient. Give them a chance to catch their breath and rest up before a boss, and they could usually reset themselves. That was exactly what the group was doing now. James was growing impatient. Come on already, James muttered as he watched the party. Scanning over their information, he could see they were all back to full health, and Z was handing out the Dickon meat to everyone. As they ate the tasty-looking meal, James realized part of his frustration was actually jealousy. The meal looked delicious, and yet he was stuck, unable to taste it. He would have to look into remedying that. If he could grow tentacles, maybe he could grow a mouth flavor.
Next level!
So eager to watch the Terminus fall. Speaking of jealous, Rue was munching on more popcorn, a twinkle in her eyes as she glanced from James to the party. I'm just excited for the fight, James responded back, diverting his eye from the popcorn. He was unusually hungry this immersion session, and if he had to guess, it was in part due to his inability to eat much during the day. People always warned not to go to bed hungry, as it often led to some ridiculous gorging sessions while immersed. Mainly because when you were immersed, there were still some functions that could override the immersion experience. One of those was hunger. A body's primal need for food simply could grow too overpowering, and as such, you would spend your entire time immersed feeling hungry. In James's case, these hunger pangs that were starting were not a good sign. It was only a matter of time before he became hangry. Liar. Rue chuckled and tossed a piece of popcorn at him, which bounced off his glowing form and simply disappeared. You're starving. He had made multiple comments about his hungry state previously, given her love of snacking. And it's not like we can do anything about that, James grumbled, turning back towards the party. They were finally standing, checking over their gear, and going over Z's battle plan once more. It was a pretty simple plan, aided by the fact that Z and his team had already fought the Terminus before. Because of that, they felt confident in its attack patterns. Of course, they didn't know about the Terminus's latest upgrade. Maybe not right now. Rue trailed off deep into thought as James stared at her. For a long moment, she said nothing and only seemed to open and close her mouth as if wanting to say something but uncertain about it. After another minute, she shook her head and turned back on her mischievous smile. Never mind. Oh, great. She was back to being not helpful. He also wondered if there was something she wasn't telling him. And if that was the case, was it because she didn't want to or couldn't? He really felt he needed more information, and he wanted to figure out how he could get more. Perhaps being rank 1 would get him some more answers. You're so weird, James muttered back to her, though he was watching the raid party with growing excitement. They had established their formation, with Oak and Scar in the front, followed by No More and Manly. Behind them, Z, Trold, and Elm stood with their bows drawn, knocked with the metal arrows James knew came from the second floor. At the rear of the party, Medic, Olivia, and Faust stood, looks of determination across their faces. Z had assigned each of the healers to one of the tanks, with their task being to keep the tanks alive. The DPS was to fan out and take cover behind the cars, doing their best to hit the Terminus's weak points and wear down its health as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Faust was to prepare his strongest lightning spells and blast the Terminus whenever he had the chance, while avoiding drawing aggro and getting attacked. It was a solid plan, and the raid party, all 10 members, plus their menagerie of pets, plus the honey badger, strolled into the Colosseum looking exactly like a conquering party. As they walked in, Oak raised his hand, signaling the party to stop, just as the doors closed behind them, locking them into the boss zone. Then the warrior raised his chainsword to the sky in some strange form of salute. For a brief second, everyone looked at him strangely, before the members of the Knights all grinned and did a similar salute. We who are about to die salute you. And with those words, they lowered their weapons again, their eyes once again focused on the Terminus's lair, though their faces bore grins from some sort of inside joke. Scar's group just looked confused, but they were ready, and once again they began to take up their positions. Once everyone was situated, Scar and Oak took up places near the Terminus's lair. The honey badger rushed into the lair and let out a fearsome, especially given its small stature, growl. That honey badger really didn't care. In response, twin red lights began to glow from deep within, and the very earth trembled as the Terminus rose from its slumber, its eyes focusing on the honey badger. I humbly accept your challenge, good sir, a deep mechanical voice said from within the lair. Prepare to die. Chapter 77. Did the boss just talk? Was everyone's immediate question as the Terminus began moving slowly towards the exit from his lair. The honey badger, to the little creature's credit, continued to hold its ground, growling at the monstrous boss. Obviously, talking bosses was not a new thing in MMOs. Many final bosses in raids even had monologues, which actually helped further the storyline. Heck, even Old Man Jenkins seemed to form slight words and phrases when people were fighting him. However, the last thing James, and likely anyone else, expected was for the Terminus, a monstrous mass of steel, leather, gears, and death, to start talking. What's more, the fact he spoke with a British accent was a bit much. Rue flashed James a smirk.
You don't say.
The pixie waved her hand, making her popcorn disappear, only to be replaced with a box of sour gummy worms. She took one out and chewed on it blissfully, making a wave of hunger wash through James. Damned pixie.
The moment you activated that skill on the Terminus, it unlocked a specially generated AI for the boss monster. While all of your mobs generally have basic programming coded into them with simple AI, boss monsters have the opportunity to evolve even more. Old Man Jenkins has been slowly evolving, and with the latest upgrades in your research levels, should have reached a level of sentience which will open up new tiers of activities on the first floor.
She grabbed another gummy worm, savoring the moment of explanation, as James kept darting his attention from her to the Terminus. The T-Rex was almost at the end of the tunnel, while the entire raid party was glancing around nervously. They had heard the voice from within, and were now feeling a little less confident, especially because the Terminus was taking his sweet time leaving his lair, whereas he normally came charging out.
As for the Terminus, by force upgrading him, you fully unlocked his AI, and he is now at his peak intellectual capability.
Big words for the pixie. For a second, James was wondering if she had upgraded her intellectual capability.
So now, you literally have a boss that is a proper sir.
She shoved a few more gummy worms in her mouth as she finished. Nope, it was definitely still his normal Rue.
All right, well, what exactly does that mean for the fight?
James trailed off as he heard multiple thunks erupt from within the lair. The Terminus was a few feet away from the honey badger and had paused, choosing instead to raise his little arms and launch a trio of his grenades from one arm. The sudden grenades flying from within the lair definitely caught the adventurers by surprise, and James couldn't help but chuckle as the tanks and melee members let out slight curses and backpedaled away from the projectiles. Z had likely informed Scar's group of the AoE range on those specific weapons and of the damage they could inflict even at maximum range. At the same time, though, James watched the red eyes of the Terminus flash, and it was almost as if there was a deep intelligence in the crimson light. A deep, evil, cunning mind. Without warning, the Terminus shot its head forward, clamping down completely on the poor honey badger before the growling mammal even had time to react. As if on cue, the Terminus's inner core seemed to roar to life, and James could tell its unique trait, Terminal Fire, had been activated along with Big Head. Big Head was going to keep the honey badger out of the fight for 20 seconds and take away a quarter of its health bar during the entire time. At the same time, Terminal Fire's passive meant an additional 0.5% of the honey badger's current HP was going to be chunked every second. It was a brutal combination, which was going to result in even faster HP drain of the poor, proud creature. It also went to show that Terminus was definitely on a whole new playing field, and that maybe, just maybe, James had made this a little too difficult. But then again, was he really to blame? He was just like the players in that he was still learning, and how could he have predicted the outcome of these new upgrades? This was just one of those moments in a game where the newest skills and equipment just happened to work together a little better than planned. James just hoped it wouldn't keep the Knights away for too long when the party wiped. Because as James watched the Terminus sit there lazily devouring the honey badger, he was certain the Terminus was going to win.
This is going to be a massacre,
James whispered as he and Chat waited. There was actually a timer someone had placed into the core chat for his live stream, counting down both the CD on the Terminus's right arm grenade launcher, as well as how long the honey badger was trapped in Big Head for. The first timer was labeled More Cowbell, 19 seconds, and the second was Om Nom Nomosaur, 8 seconds. On top of those witty chat titles, there were now active bets going on in the chat room, with the Dungeon Cores actually setting up V-Coin bets with each other. While Dungeon Core players couldn't interact with each other's instances, nothing said they couldn't personally send each other V-Coins through their DCO accounts. Currently, it seemed most of the bets were for who would die first in the fight, if they would defeat Terminus, and how long before the party wiped. Skimming the string of bets, James could tell they were all on the same page. The raid was doomed.
It could always be worse.
Rue, the ever-hopeful pixie, grinned as she ate another of her sour treats. James was certain she was purposefully eating them slowly when she spoke to him, knowing he was hungry. He could feel that hangry sensation rise within him before he pushed it down a split second later.
Yeah? And how could it be worse?
His irritation came out in his voice, yet all that seemed to do was encourage the pixie, whose smirk grew even wider. Rue raised 2 fingers, preparing to count them down.
Well, first, you could have upgraded the Terminus with the Godzilla trait, which would have allowed him to really do some massive damage to the tanks.
She lowered a finger. That was a good point. Another long-range attack, which the intelligent boss could do from within his lair, seemed even more dangerous
Some leaves
now.
must fall.
And the second way?
The boss could be purposefully stolen if he wanted, to allow for the 10-minute cooldown on the mini-boss to finish.
James's entire body went cold as the pixie's smirk grew to fully encompass her face.
The LU could respawn?
As if reading his mind, the pixie flicked her wrist, pulling up a new timer. A timer only he and she could see. Mini-boss, BLU. 1 of 2 remaining. 1 spawn per 5 players. Respawn. 3 minutes, 28 seconds. Of course, that made sense. Just like the mobs could respawn, James didn't see why the mini-boss couldn't respawn. After all, unlike the boss mob, players didn't get a time limit to advance to a new floor or leave the dungeon when they killed the mini-boss, which meant it could be killed multiple times by the same party. And while mobs could respawn once per player in an instance,
Be
the once
wary.
per 5 players in an instance made sense as well. As seemed to be the norm, a 5-player dungeon party was ideal, so the developers figured the majority of players would be in 5-man parties for the floor. It wouldn't be right then to just have the mini-boss spawn once, eliminating the opportunities of later parties in the same instance to defeat the mini-boss. What concerned James was, if what Rue mentioned was true, his boss might be aware of that timeline as well. And if the ultimate cognivore was released again, it was over for the raid party. James really needed the raid to do something, and fast. If they had any hope of winning, and if James had any hope of keeping his streams popular, they needed to act. As if Z could sense his wishes, the Elven Ranger raised his bow. One of his second-floor arrows knocked.
All right, boys. The moment he releases Badgie, you all know what to do.
He drew back his arrow, and the rest of the ranged DPS all prepared their own attacks. Just as Nomosaur hit 0 and the Terminus's mouth opened wide to release the trapped and pissed-off Honey Badger, the entire fight changed. Chapter 78. Z's arrow was the first to smash against the Terminus, followed almost instantly by a glowing arrow from Elm, a barrage of arrows from Trold, and a single lightning bolt from Faust. The attack smashed against the Terminus's armored plating, and for a second the flash of light fully illuminated the monstrous boss within his lair. In that second, as the beast opened its mouth, James and Rue could see the Honey Badger, pissed off beyond belief, leap not away from the boss, but back onto it, clinging tightly to the monster's maw, trying to bite at its armor plating near its throat.
That badger really doesn't give a damn.
Rue's comment made James chuckle as he watched the little animal go to town on the Terminus. Curious, James pulled up the boss's information. James was impressed, actually, as he checked the Terminus's health. From what he could tell, the group had managed to do almost 400 damage to the boss in that single opening attack. The biggest reason, of course, was the fact that the Terminus still didn't have much magic resistance. As much as James wanted to give his boss even greater magic resist by further upgrading his leather insulation stats, he had chosen not to. It was, after all, only the second floor. However, as he eyed Faust's lightning bolt ability, James had to admit the mage was a tad overpowered against his boss. Lightning bolt. 10 times overall level plus 3 times lightning mage level damage. Channel time, 5 seconds. Cost, 20 MP. Cooldown, 5 seconds. Magic users in DCO, James had found, didn't have flat damage applied based on their attack stats. Instead, all of the spells seemed to scale off of the user's level. That meant, while a physical class such as a ranger would see constant increases by upgrading their gear, mages would not. At least, not yet. James was certain there would be items that would increase spell damage by percentages, as there always were in games. It also evened things out in James's mind. The mages needed new gear to increase their survivability, but grew in magic strength mainly by leveling up. This meant their high damage output couldn't jump as astronomically as, say, a ranger who was wearing gear that completely increased his attack power by 50%. Of course, against a boss with a high physical defense, that increase in attack power did little to help.
Right. It seems I may have underestimated the lot of you.
The Terminus's metallic voice pulled James away from his musings and back to the fight. As the boss spoke, it took a step out of its lair, revealing its entire form to the party assembled in the Colosseum, and revealing its many new upgrades. The most obvious change was the top hat sitting atop its metallic head. Of course, the hat was made of metal as well, but it was a rich, dark metallic color, making it seem very much like a classic top hat from an old-era movie. The other changes included thicker plating around its body, which helped cover the previously available critical gear points that Z and his group had discovered. The least obvious was the layer of leather that was now underneath the metal plating, which provided the 10% magic resist to his boss. It wasn't much, but it was all he could really justify adding at this time. Oh, and there was the fact that Terminus was now glowing slightly, a deep orange seeming to radiate from within its very core. This was, of course, the radioactive core that James had upgraded his boss with. The passive burn was too nice of a bonus to pass up, and James couldn't wait to watch the second part of that ability go off. Of course, the group would need to defeat the boss first. "Stick to the plan," Z called out, breaking his tanks out of their stupor as they looked at the boss. It was Scar's group's first time ever seeing the Terminus, and it was definitely a sight to behold. However, even Oak had been frozen in place, his eyes going over the boss once again, and James was sure the tank was remembering his last unfortunate encounter with the Terminus. Getting eaten was one thing, but what the perfect cognivore did to him was just downright dirty.
Oh, you know what they say about plans of mice and men.
The boss chuckled deeply as it turned its head towards Z, its eyes narrowing dangerously. It leveled one of its arms towards the archer, and James watched a grenade chamber itself in the weapon. Z was moving even as the boss spoke, ducking behind a car, preparing for the attack.
They often go awry.
As the Terminus finished his saying, a monocle dropped over his left eye from his top hat, and his left arm lifted almost instantly, launching a trio of grenades flying directly into Faust. The mage, mid-channel for his magic missile barrage, didn't even get a chance to dodge. The sudden attack, so completely unexpected, so outside the realm of what should have been a scripted boss mechanic fight, left everyone completely speechless. That, and the fact, with the Terminus monocle, his accuracy and range seemed to have increased. Needless to say, Faust's body burst into an orb of light before anyone could even call out. "All right, guys," Z called out, peeking around his cover at the boss, who was definitely grinning. "New plan!" The Terminus let out a chuckle and turned his eyes back down to the group of tanks who were approaching warily. "And what would that be, Z?" Scar's voice held a tinge of doubt in it as the Terminus's red eyes seemed to glow with amusement. Sure, they had done almost 20% of its life in their opening attack, but the Terminus had just eliminated their highest damage dealer in a split second. Survive! Chapter 79.
I do say, good shot, old chap.
The Terminus was chuckling evilly as he glanced at Z, who had just hit the boss's monocle with a piercing arrow. The projectile ignored 50% of the Terminus's base defense and hit for 71 damage. What's more, it cracked the monocle, which James was certain the Terminus had been using to better target the adventurers. Since Z's newest plan, to survive, was enacted, the raid party had been doing its best to keep the Terminus occupied as they whittled down its life. The Knights, even down one member, were doing admirably. They were veterans of MMOs. They knew how to act without needing to call out their commands, especially since James figured they didn't want to give anything away to the Terminus. Scar's group, on the other hand, were a lot less organized, but were aiding in the best ways they could. Because of the differences in coordination, the Terminus seems to be paying more attention to taking out the higher-level knights first, though the boss was not missing opportunities to pick away at any member that was foolish enough to leave themselves open to an attack. So far, the boss was sitting at a little over 1,700 health, and the raid party was down to 8 members. That was because Manly the dwarf had gotten himself caught in the Terminus's stun when it dropped below 80%. To his credit, the dwarf had tried his best to survive. The moment he was stunned, the Terminus had swung its mighty tail down at the dwarf, intending to crush the axe duelist in a single blow. However, while Manly was stunned, there was still a cooldown the dwarf could activate, and he did. The skill, simply called Rage, had a 10-minute cooldown and only lasted for 30 seconds. During that time, the user's attack power was doubled while his defense was halved. However, while Rage was active, the user couldn't be dropped below 1 HP, and he gained 5% lifesteal for all of his attacks. The ability also came with a cleanse. It was the type of cooldown usually saved for either the final burn phase on a boss or one of those oh shit moments. So, as the tail came crashing down on the poor, stunned dwarf, the adventurer realized it was an oh shit moment and burned his cooldown. His dwarven form instantly became engulfed in glowing red energy, and either unintentionally or as a part of the skill, the dwarf let out a ferocious roar. The angry dwarf rushed towards the Terminus, hacking and slashing away at the metal plating with his twin axes. Even with his attack doubled, the Terminus still had quite a high defense. That meant each axe swing, which took a little over a second for the dwarf to make, was doing a little over 30 damage. Which, 60 damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds, would still have equaled nearly 600 damage to the boss if the boss had been standing still and taking it. Instead, Manly got in about 6 hits before the boss swung his tail in a wide, rapid sweep and sent the dwarf flying across the room. By the time Manly hit the ground and began running back towards the Terminus, his rage had failed, and even before he could get healed, a grenade ended his life. Of course, Manly's actions had probably saved the tanks, who both had also been caught in the Terminus' stun. While Manly drew aggro, the healers had been able to use simple cleanse spells to remove the debuff and return the tanks to the fight. Needless to say, it was a war of attrition, and both sides were taking damage.
Now, I must say, your form is impeccable.
The Terminus laughed as he stomped the ground, attempting to send Scar and Oak flying. The tanks stood their ground, though, their shields glowing with energy as they pumped up their defenses. The Tremor also sent No More scattering backwards away from the boss. The assassin had been attempting to sneak up on the boss in order to launch a flurry of attacks. The assassin class had the ability to ignore 50% of an enemy's defense if the strikes were deemed as sneak attacks. However, No More had yet to be able to apply any attacks on the boss, who always seemed aware of when the gnome was near. James, and it seemed Z, had figured out why. The monocle, though cracked, still had a flash of data streaming across it, and as James zoomed in on the accessory, he could see the data was providing an overlay map of the area around the boss. It seemed the top hat it was wearing was also acting as a radar, feeding the information to the boss on enemy locations in real time. So, not only was it aiding in targeting, it was also giving the boss quite the unfair advantage on the battlefield. And your form is sloppy. Z responded to the Terminus's compliment with another shot. The arrow flew true, smacking into the boss's monocle, this time shattering the accessory. The damage, however, also dropped the boss below the 60% range, activating his AoE roar. And Z's shot had caused him to leave cover, making him vulnerable to the stun this time as well.
A fair trade, in my eyes.
The Terminus leveled his grenade launcher at the Ranger, showing its teeth in an evil grin.
My advantage for yours.
The grenades launched in rapid succession, and even though Badgie, who had been steadily damaging the boss from its back, did its best to yank the boss's arm off course, the grenades still found their mark. The damage, 1 direct impact and 2 with splash damage, caused Z to burst into a white orb. The boss was now below 60%, but the party was down to 7, and with Z's death, Badgie poofed out of existence.
Badgie, No!
Rue cried out as the honey badger disappeared, and James saw his core chat was mimicking the pixie as well. That little badger had won everyone's hearts between the last two streams, and its valiant attempt to save Z's life merely cemented its place in the memories of all who were watching the fight. The Knights, of course, were calling out in angst over Z's death. With Z down, they had lost another of their DPS, and were now predominantly going to be relying on Elm and his magical arrows to pull down the boss's life. What's more, James could still see the mini-boss respawn timer, which was now sitting at 2 minutes. The raid had 2 minutes to go before the Terminus had its ally respawn and the party wiped. It was like working against a rage timer in a raid, but so much more terrible.
How you like me now?
Do it now! Z's disembodied voice called out to the party, and James felt his heart leap in his chest. Of course, part of him was looking forward to gaining even more experience from the party. Hell, with the death of Z, Manly, and Faust, James had already earned over 6,000 experience. However, as Z called out, James remembered the contingency plan he had enacted for the party. Order 66. Got it! Oak and Scar both exchanged looks and grimaced before they rushed the Terminus, one on either side of him. By the glow on their bodies, James could tell they were both blowing their cooldowns. Oaks, as a shielder, increased his defense by 100% for 30 seconds and reflected 30% of all damage he took back to the abuser. That meant that not only was he reflecting physical damage from the Terminus's stomps and tail swipes, but he was also reflecting the burn damage. Scar, as a Death Knight, had an even more interesting cooldown. His class created an energy field around itself of swirling bones and dark power. The shield was equal to his HP, but as long as it didn't hit 0, had unique properties after 30 seconds. First, Scar would be healed by 50% of the damage done to the shield. Second, the shield would erupt, dealing true damage equal to 50% of the shield's remaining health to all enemies within 10 feet of Scar. James had looked up the reference when Z had mentioned it, and knew it was from the Star Wars universe. Order 66 was the contingency order given to turn the clone troopers on the Jedi and eliminate them. Z, in his own witty way, had thought the order and seeming betrayal was an amusing code word for his own contingency plan. In it, his tanks were to blow their cooldowns to buy the healers time to cast their resurrection spells. He viewed it as a betrayal because it pulled the healers off the tanks for the 20-second channel time on the resurrection spells. However, if the tanks could survive the onslaught for 20 seconds, then the healers would be able to return to them and blow their big healing spells, and everything would work out. At least, in theory.
Good show, chaps.
The Terminus started to scan the battlefield, the AI within it suspicious of what was going on. However, before its eyes could focus on the healers and piece together the game plan, the Terminus let out a roar of anger. Using the destruction of the monocle as a cue, No More had rushed back at the boss, using this instance to activate his own cooldown. The assassin's cooldown made 2 shadowy copies of the gnome, and all 3 ran atop the boss's back until they were near its head. Then all 3, the real and the 2 doubles, began stabbing frantically into the boss. The shadowy forms each had 1/3 of the assassin's attack power, but they did their damage as true damage, completely ignoring defense. No More, meanwhile, was using his piercing daggers to punch through part of the boss's armor, allowing him to work down the monster's health as well. On top of that, No More had applied his poison to his weapons, dealing poison stacks with his attacks. Each stack of poison did 5 damage per stack per second, with a duration of 10 seconds, and James knew the game allowed for 5 stacks of poison to be applied at any given time. That meant poison alone was going to do 25 damage a second, meaning 250 damage over 10 seconds. Like James had thought earlier, Scar's group was meant to take down single-target foes extremely quickly. The DPS burn was doing its work, and with the Terminus occupied on the tanks, unable to shrug the assassin and its shadow doubles off of its back, James could see the fight was turning in the favor of Z and his raid party. However, the DPS was a bit too efficient, and 15 seconds into everyone's 30-second cooldown burns, the boss hit its next benchmark. As the boss dropped below 1120 HP, it let out another roar. This roar stunned both tanks, sent No More and its doubles flying, and caught Trolled in the stun as well. Luckily, both the healers were still behind cover, having bunkered down as they prepared their resurrections.
At first, you had my interest.
The boss shook his massive frame as his eyes narrowed. The cooldown on his grenades had finished, and with a wide sweep of his tail, he caught both stunned tanks and sent them flying into his lair. As both crashed to the ground, the Terminus launched all 3 grenades into the lair, completely wiping both tanks from existence. So what if the damage reflected to the boss? He was beyond caring. The AI was pissed. "And now we have your attention?" Z's cocky voice called out, and where his orb had been, the Ranger was once again standing, his bow raised as Badgie sprang back into existence.
Quite right.
The Terminus growled, and its massive form began rushing towards Z. Its eyes flared red, and James knew the Terminus had a personal problem with the Ranger and his Badger. They had, after all, been the ones to break its monocle, and Z was the obvious leader of the group.
Nothing personal.
The Terminus was almost to Z, who was standing his ground, launching piercing arrow after piercing arrow into the boss. The arrows were doing just under 100 damage per arrow, and with the boss on his final third of his life, they were bringing it ever closer to destruction. "Same." Z grinned as the Terminus reached the Ranger and chomped down, eating the raid leader. "It's just business." Z was laughing smugly within the mouth of the Terminus, the type of laugh that signaled the Ranger knew something the boss didn't. "And we are in the business of killing." Faust's voice seemed to crackle with power as his eyes glowed white. A massive storm cloud darkened the entire arena.
Oh, bloody hell.
The Terminus mumbled around Z's form.
Well done.
And then a massive thunderbolt leapt from the sky, crashing into the boss's form, sending electricity dancing all along its body. The mage's cooldown, Thunderstorm, had a 10-minute cooldown as well. It completely drained the mage's MP pool and did 4 times MP consumed damage to a single target, and 1 times MP damage to every target within 50 feet of the first target. Faust, having just been revived, was at full MP, a whopping 245 when he activated his cooldown. That meant the lightning bolt did 980 damage in an instant. Sure, it wasn't as much damage as if Faust had been launching lightning bolt after lightning bolt. However, the mage's cooldown had a 5-second prep time, and then launched the attack instantly. So when it came to a single target burst spell, that cooldown took the cake. Even with the Terminus's 10% reduction, the damage was still more than its remaining HP.
They did it!
Rue's cry was one of surprise and excitement, and James could already see chat was going to be a nightmare to slog through. The amount of comments, the amount of views and likes, and notifications people were saving screenshots and clips from it was overwhelming. James turned his head and motioned back to the Terminus's fallen body, his grin widening. Sure, they had defeated the boss, but as Z stepped out of its maw, as Faust and Medic and Olivia all moved closer to the body, likely to loot it, the Terminus's body suddenly began to glow. "What the?" was all they got off before the body detonated in a bright flash, wiping the members from existence, instantly turning them into floating orbs, even as the Colosseum's doors opened up, signaling the fight had ended.
Well, at least I get to loot it,
a single voice said, moving out of the Terminus's lair, holding a hand up, a hand covered in blisters. No more had ducked into the lair when the Terminus had fallen, likely checking to see if a loot box would appear where the boss had been sleeping. As such, the assassin had managed to escape the blast, but still seemed to be afflicted by the explosion's more lasting effect. Sure enough, James could see the assassin's life was cut in half and seemed to have a bar blocking it from healing any higher. The assassin's stats were also cut in half. You definitely didn't want to catch Dino AIDS. And so the assassin of the group became not only the first to be killed by a toilet mimic, but also the first to catch Dino AIDS and to loot the Terminus. His reward? Some high-level crafting pieces, some gold, and a top hat that looked quite proper. Chapter 80.
Order up!
What is this?
James was looking at the achievement screen that flashed up following the Terminus fight. He had been ignoring the screen, watching along with the stream to see what No More would do next. The assassin had donned his top hat, grinning mischievously. As James inspected it, he found out why. Apparently, the top hat was a secret part of the boss gear James knew about on the floor. The gear, similar to the demonic farmer set, had various set bonuses which could be applied based on the number of pieces the wearer had. The top hat, it seemed, had the unique trait to decrease the number of set pieces needed to be worn by one. Therefore, No More was now a farming assassin in a top hat. After that, though, No More simply sat down and waited for his countdown timer to remove him from the dungeon, much to everyone's displeasure. Chat and James still wanted to know what was in the world boss egg. The moment No More teleported out, along with the glowing orbs of the somewhat successful raid party, James had once again ended his stream, promising his viewers that he would set up another AMA on the forums shortly. He was certain the latest stream made him the most popular dungeon core on the server, even though Blank was still the #1 dungeon. The fact that Blank continued to remain completely silent on the forums was also driving James insane. What type of gamer would remain completely quiet while existing on the top of the charts?
Maybe it's a try-hard achievement.
Rue had put away her sour gummy worms and was now playing aimlessly with a lock of hair as she grinned at James.
Or maybe a consolation prize. You almost wiped the whole party out. Better luck next time.
She let out a mocking laugh.
Ha ha, you're so funny,
he replied, shrugging off her comment to turn to the screen. Her sarcasm was on point at least, a sore point for a lot of gamers. Somewhere along in history, everyone started getting awards for literally everything. They even had freaking participation trophies and awards. It lessened the impact of some achievements, since many seemed insignificant, as everyone could and did get them. However, that was the one thing James liked about the MMOs he played. Sure, there were some gimme achievements, but everything else you actually had to work for, had to accomplish. And that, plus the sweet rewards at the end, made the effort worth it. He opened up the achievement, another quip on his tongue, before he paused. Seriously? Achievement unlocked. Plague Incorporated. Successfully infect a player with a permanent, per instance, and spreadable disease. Reward: 3000 XP, 750 resources, access to disease menu. James was at a loss for words. Like, he was totally on board with the extra experience and resources, but what the hell was the disease menu?
Oh.
Rue went quiet as she scanned over the achievement. James watched her eyes, losing himself for a moment to them as the pixie completely ignored him.
Honestly, I'd prefer if you stared a little lower.
Her eyes shot to him, making him jerk away.
A giant eyeball staring intently into your eyes is just a bit creepy.
She grinned at him as she floated away lazily. He did not miss the deliberate way she moved as she drifted away. Not at all. I mean, isn't a floating orb with an eyeball and tentacles creepy already? He wiggled his tentacles around for a moment, making her grin and chuckle at his antics. After a moment, she regained her composure and turned back to the achievement.
So I've got some good news and some bad news for you.
Oh? What's the good news? James figured he would just continue to ride the high that was his current massive experience and resource gains before letting her bring him down with the bad news.
Good news is, the Plague menu is going to let you get a lot more experience, depending on how you use it.
That was definitely good news. And what's the bad news?
You are now an infectious, diseased floating eyeball with tentacles.
She floated further away from James, laughing all the time.
I don't know if I can stick around with someone giving out diseases to players.
She stuck her tongue out at him and floated away. James whipped his tentacles towards the pixie, doing his best to snare her. However, the agile tease that she was meant she easily avoided all of his attempts. After a few more minutes, which were honestly needed to further relax and decompress from the raid, James and a chuckling Rue turned back to the achievement screen. Is there actually any bad news? He asked, his tentacle hovering above the exit option. He had every intention of opening the disease menu next, but wanted to make sure he wasn't missing anything.
Not really. The disease menu allows you to craft various diseases or viruses that you can release into instances, which may randomly affect players. You can use resources to generate carriers and delivery means for these options, and add them into traps. In order to modify and evolve your diseases, you need to meet certain criteria and spend additional resources on them.
It seemed pretty straightforward, and James had played games similar to what she was describing in the past. Honestly, it seemed like the makers of DCO had done their fair share of acquisition when it came to implementing minigames and features into their own game. James had to wonder if any games in existence had escaped DCO's plans. He had a feeling none were safe. All right, well, now that, as James spoke, he closed the window, only to have another one appear. This one James couldn't help but grin at. Now he had an extremely difficult choice to make. Should he keep his fan base waiting, or push this notification aside until after he completed his AMA? Reluctantly, he decided on the latter. Rule number 1 of building a following was to deliver on what you promised, and he had promised them an AMA, and as such, he needed to deliver. Sighing, James pushed the rank up window away and headed to the forums. Chapter 81. James stared hard at the screen before him, his tentacle hovering over the submit button.
Careful with these.
As much as he loved the attention he was getting, this part of the process still had him uneasy. If there was anything years of gaming had taught him, forum topics almost always went off topic quickly. And based upon how his dungeon already seemed to be a massive random joke at times, he was certain his AMA was about to digress rather quickly as well. Oh well, he had promised them an AMA after all. Plus, the sooner he got this out of the way, the sooner he could complete his rank up.
Is that really the best titles you could think of?
Rue was glancing at his forum post, her disappointment evident.
After your hilarious screen name, this is the best you can do.
The heavy sigh that followed as she folded her arms drove her point home. Look, James rubbed tentacle across his orb. She was right. His heart wasn't in it right now. The excitement of the stream, the epic raid battle, all of that had been energizing. Now, though, this AMA almost felt like work. It was keeping him from things he actually wanted to do.
I'm doing the best I can here.
The pixie shook her head.
I call bullshit.
She waved her hand, and the title of the AMA, Glyax's Random Dungeon AMA, disappeared.
But no buts.
Her eyes narrowed.
You either do this right, or you let me take over. I'm sure the dungeons would love to have a chat with me.
The way she grinned implied she would love having a chat with them, too. James's mind and jealousy told him he did not want his pixie interacting on his behalf with all the other dungeon cores. Who knew what trouble she would get the two of them into, or how many dungeon cores would begin pestering him if they thought he was a girl, especially a flirty girl. Fine. James selected the now blank title and closed his eye. What would be an appropriate name for his AMA? What would really work for his dungeon? What would work for him? Insert randomly generated witty title here, AMA. Now with Glyax. Better? It wasn't much better in James's eye, but it was really the best he could think of right now. Even he needed a mental break every now and then. Besides, it definitely fit with a meme that floated around on the internet still, and considering his dungeon was literally randomly generated.
Not really, but I'll let it pass.
Rue floated over to the publish button and pushed it. The moment she did, the post appeared on the forum, and almost instantly, questions began flowing in. Just how many people had been waiting for this post? How many people... TM. First, Stormy. First, Exodia OP. First, Exodia OP. Damn it! Fellweather friend. Where did your T-Rex get that top hat? H. Birdie. Does Charles the Dickon have any more works or skills planned? Smuggled Puggle. What is Olivia's number? She's hot. Dimitri 69. Can you milk a mad cow? And there we go. There's the trolling. The list continued on faster than James could keep up, and so he decided, for the next hour, he would diligently do his best to answer as many of the questions as he could. Then, when that hour was up, he would let them continue amongst themselves while he got back to work. Some of the other cores seemed to be growing relaxed, but James still had a mission. He wanted to get the top spot. But first, work. Let's see. He knew he didn't need to respond to every topic, but there were ones he felt would be wrong not to, and some that just seemed like fun to respond to. Bellwether friend, where did your T-Rex get that top hat? Blyax. There was an upgrade listed for the Terminus titled Like a Sir. It increased his intelligence and apparently gave him a top hat. It is also the reason why I have Velociraptors now, as well as their monocle upgrades. Bellwether friend. Are there any other possible accessory-related upgrades for your dinos? Blyax. A couple, though a few I don't quite get. There is an upgrade for my Brachiosaurus called Tree Stars, which appears to give it a ranged attack, but I'm not sure how I feel about it, Dad. Shadow Weaver. You need to unlock those mother-effing Tree Stars, Gly. Trust me. And on to the next one. James closed out of that thread as it began devolving into pictures of a dinosaur eating a leaf that did look like a star, and various other memes and comments. I didn't have time for that. He briefly informed H. Birdie that he wasn't quite sure how to upgrade his world boss just yet, but would keep him informed, and at the same time explained to B-Man that world bosses unlocked when his event, instance, and boss research levels all hit 5. Some BS deity. Have you had tea with Sir Rexington yet? Is that even possible? James motioned towards the question and watched as Rue read it over. After a pause, the pixie, to his surprise, nodded her head yes.
Mm-hmm. Because of the level of AI that exists within the Terminus, you and I can interact with him in your original dungeon layout. Same with your demonic farmer, once his intelligence peaks and his AI becomes fully sentient. As well as the other future bosses, and even some NPCs, as you develop. The game developers wanted to establish a form of social interaction outside of just the core pixie trope of forum chats for all dungeon quests. Something about helping maintain the sanity of the core players and making them not feel isolated within the game.
Huh. James quickly responded, adding a new task to his ever-growing mental checklist of things to do. Blyax. We have not yet, as it seems he had a prior engagement with a raid party. We will plan one later. Some BSD. Don't forget the Hatter when you do. Wink emoji. Chuckling at the response, James glanced at his countdown timer for his AMA and let out a sigh. He still had a lot of time to waste on his AMA, and the questions were all over the place. Dragon. How much longer till your next floor? TM. Oh, yeah, what's next? Seriously, they knew he wouldn't get his next floor till he hit Tier 3. And obviously, if his dungeon type was random, he had no idea what he was going to get. It wasn't like he could just create a list of options and choose from the one that seemed the most popular. Sheesh, some people. He quickly responded in a much more professional way to them, and moved on. Spirit 1299. On a scale of 1 to Leroy, what's the dumbest thing you've seen an adventurer do? Alright, that one James could get behind. Especially because he had a clip saved that fit exactly this question. Grinning, he opened up another window and posted a video. The moment it posted, he linked the response to Spirit. Oh, how he loved sharing the misadventures of Dwight and his band of idiots. After sharing that and watching the views climb on the video, he felt himself relaxing. Though that might have also had something to do with the satisfied nod Rue had given him and the tentacle massage he was doing as he responded to the AMA questions. For once, it seemed entirely innocent and not designed to tease him. She had hovered behind him as she read the forum topics with him and watched his responses. While leaning against his orb, she had begun lightly massaging the tentacles as they protruded from his floating body, as one would massage someone's shoulders or back while they sat behind him. The feeling was pleasant and relaxing, and with the pixie's presence and the replay of Dwight's party wife, James couldn't help but return to a good mood as he answered more and more of the questions being presented to him. In fact, he was so relaxed he didn't even realize his hour had passed until his alarm pulled him from his zen state. Oh, that was nice. He exited out of the AMA window as he simultaneously stopped his alarm. But now, on to better things. He pulled up the ranked up screen, preparing to activate it.
Mm-hmm. I'm always ready for better things.
The pixie's sultry voice caused his body to freeze and go rigid. He did his best to regain his composure as she flew away from him, chuckling. After a second, he confirmed his rank up and began the next stage of his dungeon improvements. There were things that needed to be done, especially before any other player began venturing too far into his second floor. Chapter 82. James loved ranking up. Honestly, it was probably one of his favorite parts of the game, other than, of course, watching adventurers get eaten by minions. That just never got old. As was normal for rank ups, James watched as his Tier 2 mobs, including the bosses, all leveled up. As a Tier 2 Rank 6 dungeon, his basic mobs on his second floor were now level 20, BLU was level 25, and the Terminus had reached level 30. Given the fact Z's team was only level 24, it was still going to be a while before the adventurers were easily farming his second floor. Even longer if James left the second floor as it was, but he felt that just wouldn't be right. For this reason alone, James resisted the urge to upgrade all of his Tier 2 mobs with the skill points that unlocked for each of them. Sure, it would mean more death and destruction, but James needed adventurers to venture into the second floor and at least feel like they had a chance. Otherwise, they would all just stick to the first floor and grind out as much as they could, which would severely limit the amount of experience James was gaining. And that just wouldn't do. He wanted to hit Tier 3 this immersion, and he knew it was possible. Along with resisting the urge to upgrade his mobs, James looked at the primary version of his second floor and began tweaking it once more. The first thing he did was decrease the amount of Velociraptors roaming around the map. He didn't completely eliminate them, but he decreased the packs to a 3-in-1 split. So, 3 Velocity Raptors and 1 Velociraptor per pack. James also moved the packs around a bit for their starting points. Of course, they would continue to have the ability to roam, as they seemed to really enjoy doing, but they would at least start further away from the other packs, meaning less likelihood of the barrages like what the raid party faced. Finally, when it came to his second floor, James used his additional 20 points to add in another 2 breakers. These mobs proved good training enemies for the parties, in James's opinion, as they were not only massive and tough to damage, but there was always the opportunity for a roaming raptor pack to join in the fight as well. Add in the Archeo Repairers that would do flyby healing, and adventurers would need to work on their teamwork and tactics to bring these mobs down. Of course, since they were the highest cost basic mob on the floor, the experience reward would help players attempt to level faster and give James a potentially larger experience reward if or when they fell. And even with the nerfs to his floor, he was sure he would still average 1 or 2 deaths from each party that stepped foot on his second floor. Decent odds in his mind, and also odds that weren't so overwhelming players would outright avoid his floor. And found himself grinning with anticipation as he rubbed his tentacles together. He saved his changes and closed out of the optimization tools for his second floor. With his mobs taken care of for his second floor, the next task with his rank up was to take a quick note of all his gains.
All you can eat.
Glyax, Tier 2, Rank 6 dungeon. Mob type, random. 210,060 XP. 9,940 XP to next rank. 89,940 XP to next tier. Resources, 1,649 of 2,900. Currency, 84 copper, 19 silver, 5 gold, 0 platinum. Dungeon tokens, 9. He did a double take as he took in how much experience he had actually gained from the party wipe. Because Star's party members hadn't managed to level up before the Terminus fight, James netted all of the extra experience from the achievements they'd have been gaining. He also netted the experience the survivors had received from defeating the Terminus before they died to the terminal fire. Unlucky for them, considering those who were dead when the Terminus had fallen got to keep the experience they gained from the fight, as well as the achievement experience they likely received. James couldn't help but feel sorry for Z and the Knights, if at least just a little. Talk about bad luck. He had a hard time believing Z would be entertained by that turn of events. Oh well. With his experience gain, and seeing he was already over halfway towards his next rank, James couldn't help but feel giddy. He didn't care how good Blank was. There was no way. Incoming PM request from Blank. A window popped up in front of James, pulling him from his victorious mullins. Confused, he glanced at Rue, who it seemed was playing some sort of card game against a holographic projection of the Terminus. For a second, the two AI just stared at James, before the Terminus tipped his hat, somehow, towards James, and flickered away.
Don't judge me.
Rue said haughtily, before she turned her attention to the notification in front of James. He hadn't been under the impression dungeon cores could send and receive private messages while logged in. Even more concerning, why would Blank be messaging them? He had never seen a single post from the mysterious top dungeon.
What do you think Blank wants?
The pixie shrugged her shoulders at his question and motioned towards the accept button.
Won't find out till you open it.
You don't say.
James sighed and moved his tentacle towards the option. For some reason, a sense of dread filled him as he accepted the message. The dread was confirmed as he read through the message. Oh no. Chapter 83. From Blank. Subject, beginning of the end. Blyax. First, Blank would like to congratulate you on a truly spectacular boss fight. Your streams have been extremely entertaining, and it is obvious you have been putting a lot of work into your dungeon. Blank can appreciate and respect that. However, while your hard work has been evident, and you have been pushing yourself to keep up, there are a few things that don't quite add up. The lesser of the two evils is probably the rate at which you have been discovering new things. Obviously, BCO is full of secrets and opportunities. However, you seem to be stumbling across them at an impressive, almost unnatural rate. This Blank can only deduce is in part due to either outside assistance or the possibility of insider hunting. However, because you share this information readily on the forums and through your streams, the knowledge you are gaining from unfair or questionable means can be forgiven. The greater evil, though, has to do with your research levels. Let's be honest, even if you were spending all of your dungeon tokens on research, your levels still couldn't hit what they have, given the exponential increase in time per research level. Therefore, it is painfully obvious that you have received an unfair edge. This is blatant favoritism. Others may never notice this, but know that Blank has, and in the spirit of fair and equal gaming, has deemed you must be punished for your actions. You may think cheating is okay, but know that your ranking, your status just below Blank, will be short-lived. For the next immersion, Blank will personally knock you down a notch. Blank does not lose. James scanned the note once more, staring blankly at the words floating before him. Blank had figured him out, or at least Blank figured part of it out. James wasn't cheating. He was not conspiring with the dead or bribing them for some kind of special treatment. In fact, he had not sought out the unfair advantage he received at all. The boost to his research levels, thanks to his title, had been totally random and could just as easily have happened to any other core. However, because of his NDA, he couldn't possibly tell anyone that, which meant he would have to suffer Blank and any other dungeon core that realized he had an unfair advantage of accusing him of cheating or somehow conspiring with the devs for preferential treatment. It left a bad taste in his mouth, but he wasn't going to punish himself for it. Of course, what really scared him was the last part of the message. Blank was threatening to punish him. Blank was threatening to knock him down. But how? Not even Xander had been able to really... Xander! James called out loudly as he pulled his eyes away from the message. He knew the lead developer was likely monitoring his instance of DCO in some way, so it had to be possible to grab his attention by calling for him. And if there was some way Blank would be able to interact with James, Xander would have known. Plus, James felt the message from Blank would be of some interest to Xander, given how much the developer seemed to care about his experiment. James also wanted to make sure Xander saw that James had not broken the NDA, so that neither he nor Rue got punished. He was sure the developer would be looking for any excuse to get rid of James and his pixie. Silence followed James's cry, and he floated there for a moment more, looking blankly around. After a moment, he realized Rue was being uncharacteristically quiet. As he glanced at the pixie, he saw her complexion was a shade lighter than normal, and her eyes were staring down at James's first floor. As he shifted his eyes down, he saw her original shrine, once shimmering and bright, had turned entirely black. On its surface, the smiling Rue was now grimacing, a look of pain evident across it.
Seems fitting for any shrine in the image of our dear Rue here to be depicted as a goddess of bad luck. Wouldn't you agree, James?
Xander's voice held a dark chuckle as it drifted through the air.
After all, it seems she just continues to bring you misfortune.
A figure appeared beside the statue, clad in long, crimson wizard robes. James knew it was Xander, but instead of his actual visage, this time he appeared as a wise old man, the image the game offered up of Yarks.
I didn't call you here to deface her shrine.
James's voice held a dangerous hint of venom to it. He grew irritated when Rue messed with his dungeon, and he actually liked her. So the fact Xander, whom he really disliked, was messing with his dungeon really bothered him.
No, I suppose you didn't.
The developer waved a hand, and the shrine returned to normal.
Though truly, Rue has brought you once again misfortune.
The wizard disappeared and reappeared directly beside James.
I don't know what you...
A recording began playing, cutting James off.
Yeah, don't want to anger the all-seeing god, but it sure could be convenient if a goddess of luck were around to help me stumble in the right direction.
James cringed as the recording ended. All right, probably not one of James's best statements.
You aren't dumb, James, and I applaud you for utilizing every means possible to move ahead in DCO. In that regard, you're just playing the game.
Xander looked at Rue and actually offered her what appeared to be a genuine smile.
And to be completely honest, Dickin Racing was truly inspired.
The developer chuckled, and this time it was light, hearty, completely different from the X-Ray James knew of.
I miss the simple days of chocobo racing. Then why did I call her a goddess of bad luck?
Xander waved a hand, which James noticed was covered in an array of expensive jewelry. Pompous much?
Because quite honestly, James, without her and her father's connection to your parents, none of this would be going on. She is predominantly the reason why you are a dungeon core, after all. Without her, there's a good chance you would have been an adventurer. If only I were that lucky.
Xander let out a heavy sigh.
But no, instead that blasted pixie has brought this fate upon me. And now I have to put out even more fires.
His snarky tone returned.
Maybe I should have let those bullies beat you up a bit more. You're welcome, by the way.
So it had been Xander that reported the assault to his school officials. James wasn't quite sure how to take that, but realized now wasn't the time to try and process it. He had more pressing matters to deal with. There had been a reason he had called on Xander after all.
Thank you for that.
James mumbled, managing to push his pride away for a moment to thank the developer.
You're welcome.
The old man visage smiled smugly and folded his arms.
Now, I've not the time to really be wasting simply coming here to point out your misfortunes to you. So, moving on, I'm sure you summoned me specifically over the blank message you just received.
Yes. James wasn't even surprised Xander knew about that. After all, he did have the recording of James plotting with Rue on ways to get ahead in the game earlier. It was no doubt Xander had been able to read that incoming message as well. Xander sighed, shaking his head.
If you thought pissing me off was bad,
his eyes took on an evil glint.
You're going to really regret making Blank mad.
Chapter 84.
And who exactly is Blank?
The way Xander phrased his statement made James feel like the lead developer knew exactly who Blank was.
Blank, plural, are the only gamers to rival my ability. In fact, they are the only ones who could probably best me.
Xander's eyes filled with something James doubted he would ever see from him. Pride for something other than his own ability. They. That didn't make sense. Dungeon cores were run by a singular player and an AI. Xander had been quite specific about that.
Yes, they. Blank is another unique situation within DCO. Instead of having a helper AI, Blank consists simply of two players working together as a dungeon core and dungeon pixie. Rue's father wasn't the only one who got to decide on a unique instance for this experiment after all.
James didn't like the way Xander was speaking.
Who are they?
Xander's grin widened.
They're my children.
James's mind stopped when Xander said that. His what? Xander had kids? Someone actually got past his egotistical, self-serving,
Well, my adopted children.
there it was.
You adopted children?
James still couldn't believe that fact. Xander did not seem the kid type.
As I peaked in the gaming world, I was growing bored. There were no more challenges for me. So I decided I would create my own perfect nemesis. A gamer that could present me with the ultimate challenge. Of course, developing an AI to do just that seemed less genuine. So I went on a mission and eventually found not one, but two children who had the potential I was looking for.
Xander spread his arms wide.
They were both far ahead of their peers, outcasts as a result of their unique intellectual skills and traits. I took them in and began to teach them all I could. As they grew, their bond with each other became stronger than any you could imagine. They trust each other 100% and can work together to overcome any and every challenge. Suffice to say, they have bested me at nearly every game we've played.
And now they're in DCO as a dungeon core. James really didn't like where this was going. He had been relieved to hear Xander wasn't able to mess with his experiment in a way that would instantly eliminate James and Rue. However, it seemed Xander still had a trump card.
Obviously, if I was forced to make a special case for you and Rue on behalf of your parents, I was going to take the liberty to add one more factor to my experiment. He grinned. Besides, I wanted to see what would happen if I were a dungeon core, but obviously, for my experiment's sake, could not take on both roles.
So you put your children, the two who can best you, the self-proclaimed greatest gamer, into your experiment.
Xander's eye twitched when James added the self-proclaimed portion, but otherwise the developer did not give in to his comment.
Precisely. Xander's grin widened. And you've gone and done me a tremendous favor by making them mad.
But I didn't do anything.
Of all people, Xander knew James hadn't cheated. Well, other than obviously having Rue nudging him along with guiding knowledge. But hey, that was what having an AI was for, right? Or had she been giving him additional secrets that maybe she shouldn't have? That was probably the case, but was that really anyone's fault? If that was her program, if she had been given a will of her own goals, perhaps to support her dungeon as much as she could, and acted accordingly, she was simply doing as she was programmed, right? That, or she was truly acting as a human could and would, defying the dev's wishes, which would still be a marvelous feat of coding, one that really shouldn't result in punishment. Besides, that was also out of James's control.
Oh, you're right about that. You just got unlucky when you received Steve's achievement, especially considering he knew I couldn't remove such a line of code. And because of the stipulation with regards to the instance belonging to you and your pixie, I'm not able to apply special coding to counteract it. In other words, your special situation just amplified the problems for yourselves.
The old man leaned down.
But Blank doesn't know any of that.
James could see the victorious glint in the developer's eyes. He was really enjoying this.
Well, couldn't you tell them? I mean, they are your kids.
Seriously, would it be that hard for Xander to tell his kids James hadn't cheated? After all, if anyone had access to extra knowledge, it had to be...
I could.
Xander moved away from James and turned his back to him, his arms clasped behind him so.
But why would I? Especially when I know what is coming.
The way Xander said that sent a chill down James's spine, especially considering the threatening nature of Blank's message, particularly their bit about coming after him. As far as James could tell, dungeons couldn't interact with each other. What's coming? An evil smile crossed Xander's face as he flicked his wrist, causing a screen to appear in front of James. DCO Dungeon Core alert. Blank has officially reached Tier 3 Rank 1. As such, dungeon-on-dungeon interaction will become operable on the next immersion. Patch notes will be provided with the update, which will begin upon logout. The update will go live at 0 hours, 0 minutes, 1 second of Day 2 of Blank's time zone, Pacific Standard Time.
Starting tomorrow, Blank can come for you.
A new update? Blank just jumped from Tier 2 Rank 7 to Tier 3 Rank 1? What the hell was going on?
What is going on?
I guess you will have to read the patch notes.
Xander chuckled darkly as his form began to fade away.
But if I were you, I'd try to get as close to their tier and rank as possible before they come after you. Otherwise, you're not going to stand a chance.
And with that, the developer left, leaving James and Rue in an eerie silence. James turned to look at his pixie, who was trembling slightly. Out of rage, fear, or disgust, James wasn't sure. He was awash with a range of emotions as well, and his mind was trying to process everything.
What are we going to do, Rue?
The pixie turned and looked at him. Her eyes went from fear to confusion, before finally determination. A more determined, serious look than he'd ever seen on his pixie's face.
We are going to beat Blank. But first, we need to get strong.
James nodded, knowing there wasn't any other option available to them on the table. If Xander wanted a fight, James was going to give him one. Xander might have faith in his children, but James and Rue were not a force to be taken lightly. Together, he had a feeling they could overcome anything that came at them, even if for now their foe, their fight, was unknown. No matter what, James resolved, he and Rue were going to survive what happened next. After all, failure was not an option. This has been Dungeon Core Online, Remastered Edition, Book 1, written by Jonathan Smith, narrated by Travis Baldry. Copyright 2021 by Jonathan Smith. Production copyright by Portal Books.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.
You huge. Party crasher. Sushi is power. Sushi is power. I am hungry for vengeance! Sushi is power! Sushi is power! Party crasher.
This is Audible.
Dungeon Core Online, Remastered Edition, Book 2. Written by Jonathan Smith. Narrated by Travis Baldry. Chapter 1.
Are you sure this is going to work?
James was looking over everything one final time, glancing nervously between the countdown timer and his status screen. Ever since Blank's message and Xander's visit, James and Rue had been preparing. He had been working tirelessly since that announcement, doing everything he could to close the gap. James had no idea what Blank was going to do, or what the hell those dungeon gates even were, but he knew he needed to be ready. Blank was Xander's trump card, the developer's way to indirectly influence his own experiment, and a way to get rid of James and Rue once and for all. Well, they weren't going to go down that easily.
I am hungry for
It's the only possible way they could have jumped like that.
Rue was sitting beside him, her eyes serious and focused. Gone was the carefree Pixie. In its place, a pissed off and determined Pixie. James had to admit he really enjoyed this side of her, though he made a mental note not to get on her bad side. If he considered everything he had been doing the past few days to be hard work, what Rue had been doing was even more impressive. She had been not only helping him scan all of the forums and keep track of all the important data, she was also actively going over every number, statistic, and little detail available to James and helping him formulate the perfect plan. Or at least as perfect as they defined. Well, we are only going to get one shot at this, and it is dangerous, so we have to be sure, James replied. There was less than a day left in immersion. Currently, James had only managed to climb to rank 8. Barely. As the players grew, they became wiser. They were less likely to take foolish risks and lose large amounts of experience. Plus, the Reddit page had proved problematic. As gamers normally do, his players were posting about everything. That meant the surprises James normally banked on for early experience gains from new adventurers were gone. People had posted maps, mob spawn areas, stats, everything. People were even working on breaking down percentages and planning out the perfect builds to try and take down various mobs and bosses. They were, after all, gamers. That was all fine and well normally, because it made things more challenging for James and required him to adapt. But when he needed to gain levels fast to face the unknown from blank, he didn't need players being cautious and efficient. He needed mass wipes, and he needed them now. James still wasn't sure what Xander meant by claiming that blank was coming for him, but he figured, given video game logic, it would be best to be as close of a level to them as possible. It was the only way he could think of to prepare. Matching their level would give him the best chance possible, whatever their scheme was. This was about survival.
Worst case scenario, everyone stops diving into your dungeon.
Rue glanced at him and offered a strained smile.
But at least you'll be tier 3, and as ready as you could be for whatever blank does.
What really worried James about this upcoming patch was that Rue, an AI for the game, didn't even seem to know what was coming, and yet blank did. If that wasn't an unfair advantage, James didn't know what was. Bunch of hypocrites. Even if they leave for a game, I'm sure a new floor will bring adventurers right on back, James counted, although he was more hopeful than certain. So far, most of the adventurers were still grinding in preparation for the second floor boss. During the past few days, even with his last 2 level ups, James hadn't updated his mobs. He needed adventurers to grow as well, so that they had an ample supply of experience when he and Rue enacted the final part of their plan. Honestly, James kind of hated himself for not thinking of this plan sooner. Sure, it was a shitty thing to do, but it was about to net him more experience than he could possibly have ever imagined.
Oh,
Rue's eyes held their old mischievous glint for a moment.
what if you get a water level?
James felt himself mentally blanch. Okay, that would doom us. No one, absolutely no one, liked water dungeons. Hell, from what he could tell, only one person had accepted a water theme for their dungeon element, and they were still at tier 1. While DCO was great and all, an underwater dungeon floor would probably keep a large majority of players away. Swimming everywhere was a pain in the ass, no matter how great the technology was. Even if only a small percentage of players rage quit, it meant a lot less experience for James, which would be unacceptable.
Yep, water would be bad. Probably. Unless, it was something cool. Pirates, ship battles, and...
Rue started to trail off. She shook her head to refocus. Okay, yes, that would be cool. People hated exploring underwater dungeons, but a pirate-themed floor where players got their own pirate ships? James had a feeling he could get behind that. Just maybe not for his 3rd floor. Oh well, we can focus on that later, he muttered, shifting his focus. An alert had just popped up on James's screen. He had set the alert to show him when all of his new level 1 instances were filled. Less than an hour earlier, he had manually increased the number of instances, as well as their capacities, to max. At rank 6 instance research, that meant 40 instances for floor 1 and 40 for floor 2, both with a max amount of 50 players. Obviously, his floor 2 instances weren't at full occupancy, but that didn't matter. What did matter were the 2,000 players currently occupying his 1st floor. There goes nothing, James muttered, checking over everything yet again. He had the available skill points for his mobs ready. He had an open slot of research ready, waiting for whatever new research options opened when he hit Tier 3. And his 2nd research slot, for Event Research 6, had just under 8 hours to go. Which was fine, because in 2 hours, players would once again be logged out of DCO, and he would be able to go about preparing for blank's whatever in his final day before he was logged out himself. Given the alert said dungeon-on-dungeon interaction, he was guessing some sort of PvP. PvD? The plan James and Rue had concocted was to create a mass game wipe of the entire 1st floor. After browsing his options, James had found that his world boss had the ability to be manually summoned across multiple instances. James was sure it was an option to try and coordinate promotional or time-based events, especially since he was certain that at later levels of research, he could greatly modify the loot table for his world bosses. It was a nifty little tool which, used correctly, could bring in even more adventurers and excitement to a dungeon. Misused, as James was about to do, and as he was sure Blank had done previously, it could be used to wipe every player in an instance at once, depending on the power of the boss. Of course, doing so, especially if players found out it was a human doing it and not an AI, would be seen as being in bad taste. If it occurred multiple times, players would likely just stop playing. Gamers don't like broken or unfair mechanics. James was sure the only reason Blank had done their wipe, which they must have done, was to give themselves an edge for whatever the research options would be when they hit Tier 3. James would already be behind in that regard. He knew that. But he was certain he would be able to at least catch up with Xander's kids on a level basis. Blank was a Tier 3 Rank 4 dungeon currently. If James managed to kill even half of the players across all of his instances, he was bound to gain upwards of at least 100,000 XP, which would put him right into the same range as Blank. With one last breath, James looked down at the prompt on his screen. The command he had been waiting to activate. His alarm had been specific. He needed all 40 instances to be his new instances. In preparation for this wipe, James had created a new version of his first floor, one where every last mob point had gone into summoning Dickens. Now that all 40 instances each had 50 adventurers and 200 Dickens, there was only one last thing to do. One final nail in the coffin of 2,000 adventurers. Summon Tier 1 world boss across all 40 instances? Y, N. He paused for a second. Was this really the right choice? It was definitely a dick move, not something he would have done under normal circumstances. But he had no choice. He could not let Xander and Blank win. Whatever was coming, whatever Blank was planning, he needed to be ready, even if he didn't like it. James shook those thoughts from his mind. He and Rue had considered their options for days. There wasn't any other way. If he had lungs as a floating orb, he would have taken a large breath as he glanced at Rue. He nodded to her.
Release the Dickens.
The pixie exclaimed gleefully, and James did exactly that. There was no turning back now. Chapter 2. Chaos. Pure, unadulterated chaos. That's really the only way to describe what happened across the various instances James zoomed in on when he released the world boss on everyone. Charles the Dickon had always been a rather showy boss, in James's opinion, which worked great for a world boss. The massive egg appearing on the battlefield, along with the fact all the instances were full of solely 200 Dickens, had garnered quite a bit of attention from the players. From the conversations he'd overheard before it truly kicked off, they all thought this was some kind of special event. Usually, such things in MMOs would reward players with great achievements, special items, and such, which made players more willing to risk the obvious danger. Unfortunately, this encounter merely promised death, and the longer the players fought, in instances that James had tampered with to ensure utter death and destruction, the quicker they learned their folly. First and foremost, 200 Dickens meant all the Dickens were gaining their buffs non-stop. Doubling the stats of the level 10 Dickens, which he'd modified to already be quite formidable, was rather painful in and of itself. The sound of clucking was the constant buzz of death, and even as a Dickon fell, more came to take their place. Because the instances were full, the Dickens could respawn 50 times each, and with so many players, those respawns happened nearly instantly. Meaning, across the instances, it wasn't a battle of 8,000 Dickens versus 2,000 adventurers. Instead, it was 40,000 Dickens versus 2,000. And that was before Charles used his Clucky Carol skill to buff their stats by an additional 30%. The 6-foot-tall, buffed Dickens were tanky, and they took a little while to tear down, even against the better-armed adventurers. Add to this the fact that the stronger adventurers risked drawing the aggro of all the Dickens by proccing birds of a feather, and things got even tougher for the players. No matter their level or gear, no single player could survive the aggro of hundreds of mobs at once. After 5 minutes, when Charles the Dickon broke free from his egg, because players couldn't turn their focus away from the many Dickens to try and hurt the heavily armored egg, it was too late. The level 20 world boss broke free, and his loud rooster caw signaled the end. The crazy buffed Dickens, now even more empowered by the world boss, slaughtered everything. More than a few curses about the dungeon stung James's ears at the end, mostly complaining about the lack of titles and new achievements. But it had been necessary, and it had accomplished its task. Glags, Tier 3, Rank 3 Dungeon. Mob type, Random. 383,274 XP. 6,726 XP to next rank. 216,726 XP to next tier. Resources, 733 of 4,900. Currency, 36 copper, 59 silver, 7 gold, 0 platinum. Dungeon tokens, 22.
I don't think I want to do that ever again,
James whispered softly as the images flashed through his mind again. Players dying as they hoped to reach some special Dickon level of the dungeon that didn't exist, or being mowed down while attempting to kill just one more Dickon in search of secret event loot. The players had been hoping for fun new mechanics. Instead, it had been a meat grinder. A few had escaped, many died, but still gained new levels in the process, but most had been true gamers trying to figure out the secret of the event and sacrificing their experience in the process. James just felt wrong, dirty even. His hand had been forced, he knew that, but that fact made him feel even worse. Xander, or more James's fear over the unknown and what Xander had planned, had made him stoop to their level. They had made him break the trust of his players so that he could protect the dungeon they loved from whatever was coming. The frustration, anger, and more than a little shame merely furthered his resolve to come out on top. He would make Xander and Blank pay for this.
It was the only way.
Rue lightly touched his oar, pulling his focus back towards the screen, the reward for their dirty deeds.
I suppose.
James pulled himself from his musings and turned back to the screen. It was important. Preparation was key. Being overly cautious was the way to ensure victory. Hell, there'd been an anime about that once, and James had to admit the anime had a point.
Let's not let their sacrifices go to waste.
Rue's eyes flashed, and James could tell the pixie was shaking herself free of the regret a lot faster than he was, likely due to her being an AI. Damn pixie.
Besides, it's not like you killed anyone permanently. You never feel this way for slaughtering countless mobs in other games, do you?
Did you just compare all the players to mobs? James raised his eyeball at the pixie.
Come on, that's what they are to you as a dungeon corp, aren't they? Enemies that you have to kill to gain experience, which respawn and keep coming back.
Okay, she had a point. In a mass murderer kind of way, but still a valid point nonetheless. Her father had to be a slightly weird man. This was some pretty harsh anime-level logic the guy had programmed her with. But James could get behind it. If he went with that thinking, the majority of the players who were constantly coming into his dungeon were mobs. The only reason he felt remorseful was because he had just unfairly massacred so many of them to grow stronger.
Nice
That
beach ball.
and the comments he heard. But those comments, he knew, were fleeting. Gamers bitched about unfortunate party wipes all the time.
All right, enough of this depressed crap.
James slapped his orb with his tentacles, looking back at his stats screen. The plan had worked. With less than 25 hours left in immersion, he had broken into Tier 3 and reached Rank 2. He now had access to another floor, had increased his resources, and more importantly, unlocked new research. His goals had been met, and now he needed to get back to work. Blank still had an advantage, and James needed to close the gap.
Research first,
James said aloud as he navigated his screens. He and Rue had agreed the first thing they would need to do was start his new research. Just as before, gaining a new tier had unlocked new research options. Core Defense, Core Offense, Avatar. That was unexpected. James really didn't know what he had been expecting, but he had definitely not expected this.
Oh,
Rue paused, her eyes distant. From what he could tell, her eyes were rapidly skimming something. After a rather long, painful bit of silence, she nodded to herself.
I see.
Care to fill me in?
The pixie chuckled darkly.
They're going to start the dungeon wars.
Yeah, that didn't sound ominous at all.
And the dungeon wars are?
Seriously, they had under 25 hours left in immersion. He needed to get to work.
Dungeon wars are a way for towns to interact with each other directly.
The pixie let out a sigh.
I just received access to notes on them when you hit Tier 3.
All right, so I'm guessing this research is important.
Scanning for targets.
Had Blank known about the wars beforehand and rushed Tier 3? They had to. Xander was definitely the cheater here. But at least Rue had gained the appropriate access now. They may have gained the knowledge late, but they could still make this work. James quickly
Geraldo,
used a
at your
dungeon token,
service.
bringing him
Yes,
down to
my
21
friend.
to finish Event Research 6. Immediately after, he started all 3 of the new research options he'd just gained and instantly completed them with dungeon tokens, giving him level 1 in each. Then he started their next level, watching their timers begin to tick down. Even with enhanced research, they would still take nearly 23 hours. He would need to wait to do anything more until he had more information. Rue nodded, her eyes still looking over whatever she'd just been given.
Oh yeah, the research is most definitely important.
She was distant, and James had to wonder just how much information she was taking in. It was strange the AI hadn't just unlocked the information and automatically known it, but instead seemed to have to consume it as a human would. James figured that was part of Xander's plotting. He bet the developer had purposefully sent it to Rue in such a way to further slow James and his preparations. Time was the biggest resource against James, and Xander knew it.
Benjamin
He
is
waited
in the
patiently,
house!
painfully, as she kept reading. After another long moment of twiddling his tentacles, Rue looked at him, her eyes sparkling. She grinned, a fang protruding over her lip.
So, let me tell you about Dungeon Wars.
Chapter 3.
First, tell me what you know about DCO so far.
James hadn't been expecting a question from Rue, especially since the pixie had just said she would tell him about Dungeon Wars. However, he knew from roughly a month in immersion with her that this was just how she was. If he didn't go along with her way of doing things, they'd get nowhere.
Other than it being a secret experiment of some sort by the government and that asshat Xander?
James shared in the smirk that the comment brought to Rue's face. After all, there really wasn't much the developer could do to them right now, considering he was already knowingly pitting his overpowered gamer kids, who appeared to have advanced knowledge of game mechanics, against James and Rue. Jackass.
Yes, other than that.
Rue sat back in a summoned chair, lightly sipping a mug of hot cocoa.
Well, DCO splits the player base into instances limited at 10,000 players or less. In my case, that is my town. In other cases, like large cities, they are sectioned off into grids or blocks for the player base. That means a large city can have multiple dungeons for all of its players.
Go on.
Because of how DCO is structured, the game has the potential to affect the real-world economy for each instance's base.
Awesome.
James had already seen as much in his town's Reddit. Players were trading gold and equipment for V-coins, and the conglomerate that had built the Adventurers Hall had also begun setting up an exchange. Some players had taken to simply accepting gathering or training type quests from that exchange, and were making a decent amount of V-coin from what James could tell. What some players lacked in skill, they made up for in money, it would seem.
That is correct.
Rue took a sip.
However, it goes deeper than that.
How so?
From what I've found out, the developers intended on ways to open dungeon instances to each other, allowing the economies of the towns to become linked to other towns and cities. As such, it would almost become an incentive for players of an instance to excel and push deeper into their dungeon in order to capitalize on the goods and services they can provide to any adventurers visiting their instance from another.
So I'm guessing, like, rare or unique items from one instance could fetch a high price from other players in other instances.
It made sense. James knew just how competitive and lucrative the rare item market could become. And given what he had seen of all the different types of dungeons out there, he was sure there was going to be a flood of unique items to fill the market. Also, he already saw in the Reddit that players had created gambling halls, pleasure houses, and the like. While a lot of players were adventuring, some were merely taking advantage of the state-of-the-art realism in the game. Some were even saying it was even better than the Zone. With the technology and features of DCO, as well as the massive backing the game got from the government, James had a feeling that was part of its purpose, too.
Mm-hmm.
She set her mug down in front of her.
However, that is only part of the interaction between dungeon cores.
Is the other related to Dungeon Wars? It really wasn't a large leap to guess where this was going.
Yep. On top of the obvious market that could open by allowing players access to other instances, the developers added in another mechanic, which as a gamer I am sure you know the allure of. Player versus player content.
Oh yeah, James was quite familiar with that. So are they going to allow players to use these dungeon gates to invade other instances and kill their players?
Yes and no. There are two different types of dungeon gates, as far as I know. The first allows players to travel between instances and interact with the town outside of the dungeon, meaning they can go to the different shops, visit the adventurer's hall, and so on. The other type is related to Dungeon Wars and teleports adventurers to another dungeon. Once inside, the players can kill mobs and players native to that instance, gaining the experience those players had saved up when they died.
Well, that wasn't good. Usually, PvP was just a test of skill, and players reveled in it because it offered challenges facing normal mobs wouldn't. Occasionally, the experience gain would be higher, and there might be the bonus of looting some of the other players' gear, but being able to steal all their experience? A group of hardcore PvP players could essentially start to completely demoralize a player base. An instance full of PvP players just invading instance after instance would soon cause a massive leap in player levels. So the players have the opportunity to start jumping up in levels. Where is the benefit for the core those players belong to? James could tell what the downfall would be for any dungeon constantly getting invaded. If the PvP players were taking all the experience, well, then James wouldn't be getting any, which would greatly slow his growth and harm his ability to keep growing. While his players could likely still enjoy DCO through the Dungeon Wars gates, as well as visiting other dungeons with the other types of gates, James's own progress would halt. And if he couldn't grow, Xander and Blank threat aside, he couldn't prove himself to whoever was running this experiment, meaning his dreams of standing beside his parents would be crushed as well.
Oh, that's the thing,
Rue continued.
Dungeons benefit too. When dungeon gates are open between instances, each dungeon gains a percentage of the experience their adventurers are gaining from enemy players and mobs.
So, invading other dungeon core instances would offer James another stream of experience, and potentially a much larger source at that. A new problem was starting to form in his mind. With this new mechanic, Blank could practically feast on him and destroy his dungeon and player base, and knock him out of this competition for good. Surely this was what their threat had been all about. This wasn't good. So, is that what Dungeon Wars are going to be? Just instance after instance invading each other, sending their players in to try and bring down the others? If so, what is with these new research options? He'd advanced them because they were obviously related to the Dungeon Wars, but he didn't actually know what they were for yet. Rue flew over to him, settling behind him as her hands lightly drifted along his tentacles.
Well, that's where the true fun begins.
As she spoke, the research trees opened up, showing the countdowns. Beside them, she pulled up the different windows he had seen. She pushed aside the core offense and core defense options and selected the avatar option.
You get to actively participate in the Dungeon Wars yourself.
Chapter 4. I get to what? James was pretty sure she had just said he would get to participate in the Dungeon Wars, but that didn't make sense. That went against the whole "you cannot tell anyone you are the Dungeon Core" clause of being a Dungeon Core. It was like Fight Club. You just didn't talk about it.
You get to take part in the Dungeon Wars.
She selected the option to continue to the next screen, and before his eyes, a new tab and display opened. Avatar creation. But I thought we couldn't interact directly with our players.
You don't.
Rose smiled sweetly at him, motioning towards the screen before him.
Your avatar does.
Yeah, just saying that doesn't really clear anything up for me, Rue. James crossed his tentacles, mimicking the pixie when she would get moody with him. You're not being very helpful. Rue's eyes flared with annoyance before they softened, and she smiled evilly.
Oh, I'm sorry. For a moment, I thought I was talking with an actual intelligent person. Allow me to dumb it down for you, oh mighty Clyax.
She stuck her tongue out at him, but continued. He did his best not to let his anger rise. They were both stressed. He knew that. And this was how she de-stressed.
You are not allowed to share your identity as a dungeon core with anyone. Players are not to know the dungeons are run by another human. As far as they are concerned, dungeons are generated based on coding and an advanced AI, such as me.
Uh-huh. She sure was advanced, all right. An advanced pain in the ass.
Then how do I...
The Avatar is explained away as an advanced AI meant to aid adventurers against outside threats, and to also bolster and assist adventurers when they assault other dungeon cores. In fact, avatars are a major part of dungeon wars, considering they can actively damage a dungeon's core.
Wait, what?
That was new.
Excuse me?
He was pretty sure she just said dungeon cores could get damaged. James did not like that idea.
It's not permanent or anything.
She waved a hand like it wasn't important.
During dungeon wars, the invading force cannot be thrown back unless the invading avatar and portal are destroyed. Conversely, the portal for the invading army stays open and allows for players to invade until the dungeon core of the world they have been invading is destroyed.
Being destroyed sounds like a terrible life choice,
James muttered. He really didn't like where this was going.
I suppose.
The Pixie's disregard for James's safety was a bit concerning.
What happens if my core is destroyed? What even is my core?
He was pretty sure it would be damn near impossible for players to invade worlds and destroy the floating orbs that were the dungeon cores.
Oh, right.
Rue facepalmed and waved her hand once more. The scene around James blurred, and suddenly, it seemed they were at the center of the world. A massive crystal floated easily before him, pulsing with glowing light. From it, tentacles of energy pulsed tens of hundreds of feet into the air, digging deep into the rock formations. James had to admit, it was an awesome sight.
This is the dungeon core.
She waved an arm with an exaggerated flourish towards the crystal.
From it, you gain all your abilities and control of the instance. The dungeon core fuels the very land and is also where your resources are generated. It's essentially mining your own instance, but in like a blockchain, old-school crypto mining type of way, not a world-destroying kind of way. So, all this is really just for show. It's just numbers being eaten.
Beside the core, a strange machine sat, with 3 tendril-like pipes flowing into it. From what James could see, the generator had multiple rotating parts, which seemed to be grinding away at something hard within. Underneath those parts, James could see flickers of light, as if something, a fire perhaps, were burning, consuming whatever the rotating parts ground up. From there, a single tube flowed back into the core, and James figured that was what delivered the resources to him.
This is awesome.
James turned and looked away from the core to the Pixie.
But if we are at the center of the instance, how exactly would invaders even reach the core?
Through a special gate.
Rue waved her hand, and they were again back in the air, looking down upon the main instance of his dungeon.
And where is this special gate?
Oh, it isn't located anywhere, silly.
She laughed lightly and pulled up his avatar screen again.
Avatars have the ability to summon the gate once they have gained the appropriate amount of essence during the dungeon wars.
Was that really how DCO planned it? A massive, battlegroundish, all-out battle royale, with each side killing the other and feeding essence to their avatar in order to unlock a special portal or destroy the enemy portal? James had seen similar mechanics in the past, but for the scale of DCO, James was having a hard time wrapping his head around it all.
Tell you what, Glyax.
Rue patted his orb gently, pointing him kindly back towards the avatar screen.
How about you work on creating your avatar while your research finishes up, and take some time to process what I told you. We can go into more details once you finish.
She offered him an encouraging smile before she waved her hand, and a hologram appeared in front of her.
All right, T. I've got time for another game or two while he builds his avatar.
The hologram Rue was talking to was none other than the Terminus, James's second-floor boss. Even as a hologram, it looked fierce, though James wasn't sure if the top-hat-wearing steampunk T-Rex was snarling or grinning.
Jolly good, Rue,
The hologram said.
Shall we play standard this time around? Or perhaps Commander? I remember you were working on a sliver deck. Fearsome little buggers slivers can be.
Magic. They were playing magic. Of course they were. James sighed, drowning the two of them out as he cleared his mind and went to work.
Quick, check the shop.
Chapter 5.
Thank you. Come again.
James was keen to know more about Dungeon Wars, but it seemed the game, and by extension Rue, wasn't going to reveal any more information until he had an avatar. So he let some of the pressure he felt subside and tried to have fun.
Come again.
First, he needed to focus on the task at hand. It was not easy to ignore Rue and Sir Rexit, as the Terminus preferred to be called, while they began their games. After a few moments of failed concentration, James simply floated further away from the pair. He drifted until he could no longer hear them arguing about what was going on the stack, where, and other more detailed discussions he didn't understand. James had never gotten into magic. He preferred Hearthstone and dungeon mobs. Once he had his peace and quiet, James was able to properly look over his avatar creation screen. He noticed the main tab pulled up an empty screen with a platform showing. If he had to guess, a model of his avatar would appear there once formed. Currently, it was blank, with a message stating, "No avatar selected," floating into space. To the right of that message hovered a brightly lit, inviting prompt. "Create avatar now." "Just give me a second," James said to no one in particular, as he continued to scan the rest of the screen, as well as the additional tabs that popped up. It seemed, on top of the simple avatar generation option, he had tabs for weapons, armor, skills, upgrades, and one tab labeled cosmetics.
Nice.
Why wouldn't they have cosmetics? He grumbled again to himself. Xander might go on and on about how DCO was a huge government experiment or whatnot, but the game developer obviously still wanted to make money.
Let the
James was
beat
sure cosmetics would cost some sort of currency to add on to the avatar. Gamers loved unique cosmetics, and James was no exception. He might have spent a decent amount of gold and some B-coin in order to customize his warlock in the Warcraft universe. For the briefest moment, James had a longing to log on and see his character again. He chased that feeling away, partly with focus, and partly because he felt another pang of hunger. He still had just under a day left in immersion, which meant another 23-ish hours left of suffering from these darned hunger pangs. Hopefully, he would be able to consume more than just Soylent when he woke up. Focus. James shook his orb and turned back to the options. Sadly, all the additional tabs were grayed out. The first thing he needed to do was create his avatar. There goes nothing, James mumbled. He selected the glowing option. He had no idea what to expect, and Rue had been less than helpful. All he really knew was he would be able to use his avatar in the upcoming Dungeon Wars, which, to be fair, was all that mattered. For once, selecting the option did not generate the infamous slot machine of choices that James had become accustomed to. Instead, it prompted what appeared to be a normal character creation screen, the first prompt being male or female. Male, James said. As he selected the option, a shadowy male outline appeared in the empty space. Next up, race. James scanned through the list of races. They were all the same as what players had access to, meaning there were a lot of them. Luckily, in preparation for playing DCO, he'd already looked through all of the options. He'd studied the class abilities and racial bonuses and made decisions on what type of player he wanted to be. Despite his preparation, though, he still found himself torn between human and elf. The deciding factor for him ended up being that in almost all the novels he read, the main characters, upon being brought into a virtual world, opted for human. He was tired of that trope, so he chose elf for himself. Also, well, he liked the Knights Who Go Me, and they were all elves. Finally, the extra movement speed racial feature in wooded areas would be great. For the next hour, James lost himself to character creation, as he had often done in the past. The avatar creation screen gave him countless options for customization, from hair and eye color to the various shapes, lengths, and widths of all of his features. He knew time was important, but for that hour he lost himself to his gamer side and did his darndest to make his avatar perfect. Well, that, and he actually did just lose track of time. Once he had his features completed, he selected Accept, and a new prompt appeared. Select Class. He'd not been sure if his avatar would be able to choose a normal player class. Now that it was giving him the class he'd wanted as an option, he couldn't help but grin.
James had done a lot of research, and he had an extensive background playing the type of class he intended to choose. Without hesitation, he made a selection. Class selected, Summoner. It was the pet class he had been eyeing early on. James loved playing pet classes. They offered a special type of versatility that really made them adaptive to almost any situation, meaning no matter what the battlefield looked like during dungeon wars, in theory, he could have a summon to take care of that. And just maybe, if the Avatar was such a powerful tool on the battlefield, then his pets would be stronger too. Avatar-summoned pets, he figured, would turn the edge of a battle. Upon completion, a message flashed before his eyes. Avatar 1 of 1 has been created. Additional avatar options can be unlocked every 5th level of avatar research. His avatar glowed momentarily before completely solidifying on the screen before him. As it did, and the prompt disappeared, the tabs ungrayed, showing there were now options for James to select. Finally, and expectedly, a pop-up appeared. Achievement unlocked. Deja Vu. Create your avatar. Reward 5,000 XP, 1,000 resources, access to avatar optimization options, access to dungeon wars, access to avatar training grounds. Well, that was neat. James definitely needed the resources, considering he had an entire 3rd floor he still needed to develop. As for the other options, James had already figured he would gain access to the optimization options. He had not realized, though, that creating an avatar was necessary for dungeon wars. Would he have been able to avoid blank entirely if he never created his avatar? He couldn't help but wonder if Xander had manipulated him into power. He had a feeling the developer had used his fear, along with Blank's own actions, to force James's hand. The slimy developer had played James, hitting him right where he wanted him, where Blank could finally launch an attack. James felt his anger building, but shoved it away. Unfortunately, that line of thinking was pointless now, which meant it would only waste time to worry about it. After all, he had better things to do with his time. He glanced at the final section of the Avatar screen, the Avatar training grounds, and grinned. He was eager to open that window, but figured he should arm and armor his Avatar before he tested it out. Currently, his Avatar was a simple elf, all in line, green eyes staring blankly ahead, silver hair tied back in a long ponytail. The figure was clad in basic robes, and both his hands seemed to glow with slight hints of energy.
How you like me
On
now?
each wrist, magical runes formed what appeared to be bracelets. James knew those runes marked this elf as a summoner. They were bound to their magic, and their magic was what allowed them to summon and bind elementals and magical creatures to themselves. All right, let's see the beginner gear. James smirked as he hovered over the weapons option. He was really curious what DCO would incorporate for the gear for avatars. Was it generic across the board for all avatars? James doubted it. Knowing his luck, it was going to be linked to the dungeon the avatar came from. James had a feeling his random dungeon type was once again going to throw him for a loop. As he saw the weapon options appear, all he could do was sigh. He knew it. Chapter 6. James and Rue were standing in an empty dirt arena, with various test dummies arrayed all around them. The Avatar training grounds were extremely similar to essentially every other game's test zone or training ground. An empty space to practice your skills and get used to the controls. Of course, being that this was virtual reality, the controls were easy for the most part. It came down to getting used to the UI and learning all the important nuances incorporated into the game. For instance, someone, somewhere, decided spellcasters would almost always need to use hand gestures in order to cast their spells. Thankfully, most games used the same gestures, but still, it felt a bit silly, especially when you should just be able to cast spells with your thoughts, in James's opinion. No, the controls weren't the problem. The problem was he'd been stuck playing as a floating orb for so long that finally having arms and legs again was actually a tad disconcerting. After a period of disorientation, James had finally managed to get his new limbs under control and move with some semblance of dignity. He'd waited till then to summon Rue. He could only imagine the comments and jibes which would have been flung his way had he invited her earlier. His pixie had arrived shortly after he finally finished adding equipment to his avatar. Sadly, while he had unlocked the Skills and Upgrade tab for his avatar, he didn't have any options for either just yet. His Upgrade tab, it seemed, required upgrade points, which he needed to ask Rue about. The Skills tab had options descending in rows and columns, like a normal skill tree would for regular DCO characters. Each row, though, corresponded to his research level, and sadly, the level 1 row had a single option, which was already selected and glowing. Summon allows the summoner to summon a mob equal to or less than the level of the summoner from a list of available summon options. When James had hovered over the option, hoping to see what his mob options were, he sadly didn't get any additional information. He also wasn't sure what his level as a summoner would be. Honestly, the summon skill read exactly the same as it did for players, but obviously as a dungeon core, James hadn't leveled in quite the same way as they did.
I must say, Glyax, that's definitely a look.
Rue was looking him up and down with eyes red and wet from laughter.
Trust me, this was the best they had,
he grumbled, glaring at her. And he was actually glaring for once, not just imagining himself doing so.
It was nice to be back in a humanoid body,
if for the sole purpose of being able to actually use expressions.
Uh-huh.
Rue nodded, before breaking out into another fit of laughter. Damned pixie.
Well, at Avatar Research Level 3, I get access to my second floor's gear.
That had been what James had found out when it came to the weapons and armor options for his avatar. What he had access to was based on his dungeon floors and his research levels. At level 1 and 2 of Avatar Research, all he had access to was gear from the first floor of his dungeon. Of course, for dungeons that were a single type, that simply meant upgraded stats and probably visual effects for their gear as they increased their levels. For James, it meant demonic farmer gear for levels 1 and 2, and steampunk dinosaur gear for levels 3 and 4. James shuddered to think about what would happen at research level 5. He still had to get around to creating his third floor before immersion ended. But first, he really felt he needed to get a hang of his avatar.
Well, on the plus side, you should have no problem with the fight against Blank.
Rue held her hand over her mouth as she stifled another laugh.
Because right now, I don't think Blank would take you seriously.
Thanks, brat. His elf, whom he had spent so much time making, was currently standing there in the very demonic farmer gear that they had laughed about when his adventurers first started wearing it. Compared to the generic robes the game had started his avatar in, the increases in stats seemed minor, and the gear didn't carry with it the set bonus that it did for the players. However, slight increases were better than no increases, and, as Rue said, he would be getting rid of it soon. But for testing out his avatar, it would do. Honestly, he probably should have just kept on his robes for the test run. But hey, hindsight was 20/20.
So, what all can you do, oh mighty farmer?
Rue said with a laugh.
You gonna summon up some cornbread and dickin' for us?
Considering James had been presented with the option of a giant ear of corn as a boss, that comment wasn't entirely just mocking. And considering Blank had a candy dungeon, food mobs weren't out of the question. The game was crazy.
I swear, if I summon a Dickin...
James held out his hands in front of him and closed his eyes. Doing so was needed initially for summoners to summon their pets, he knew that much. What surprised him was, as he closed his eyes and focused on summoning, a list of information appeared in front of his mind. Summoner level 5. Avatar research level times 5. Summon options. Dickin, 1 point, level 1 mob. Sacrificial lamb, 2 points, level 2 mob. Swiner, 3 points, level 3 mob. Scapegoat, 4 points, level 4 mob. Mad cow, 5 points, level 5 mob. James had known it. He had seen it coming. Of course, why wouldn't it be? Summoners in DCO were able to summon from a list of mobs from a general selection, which ranged in elemental typing and abilities. However, James figured the creators of DCO had tweaked the avatar classes to keep them from being too OP, and to keep them on theme with the dungeons they were representing. Which, as James had just found out, meant even as a summoner he would be limited in what he could summon based on his dungeon. That meant he was stuck being able to only summon his mobs, and at low levels that meant his demonic farm animals again. He would never escape his Dickens, would he? The only silver lining was he knew just how dangerous his ridiculous mobs could be. James selected his Dickon and was prompted with another window. Summon one Dickon? Y, N. He selected yes and felt his mana flow through his body. Once he'd made his selection, he opened his eyes to watch the summoning process. The runes on his wrist burned, and a small summoning circle appeared on the ground before him. A moment later, a regular-sized Dickon apparated in the space. Unfortunately, it seemed his summons weren't benefiting from the upgrades his dungeon mobs had. That was more than a little disappointing. James focused on his Dickon and pulled up its stats, curious what it was currently capable of. Dickon, level 1 summon. Type, demonic poultry. HP, 60. MP, 60. Attack, 6. Defense, 6. Unique traits. Birds of a feather. Dickons double all stats when in groups of 5. Flock together. If Dickons are repeatedly struck by non-lethal damage, the offender will pull the aggro of all Dickons within a 10 times level yard radius. Active buff. Avatar summon. All stats increased to reflect avatar level threats. Base stats times 5 plus research level. That last buff James could definitely take advantage of. It seemed while his summons didn't have his dungeon's improvements, so no roided out Dickons, they were still getting stat boosts. And while currently he could only summon one mob at a time, James had seen a level 2 skill for his summoner class that he knew now he immediately wanted. It was called Mass Summon, and it was normally a level 10 summoner ability, which allowed a summoner to summon multiple mobs. There were, of course, limitations to it, but James was certain with it, he would be able to summon what he needed. Grinning, James turned to Rue as he mentally sent his Dickon to attack the dummy. The poultry let out a cluck, the same sound James and Rue had heard countless times before, and then raced forward to obey. "I think Blank is going to regret choosing to face us," James chuckled. Rue yawned and glanced at the Dickon that was attacking the dummy.
You going to give him a good Dickon?
You know it.
James smiled a bit, then sighed. The joke was tired now. But given their previous stress and the weight of the situation, it was probably the best quip either of them could think of. James closed his eyes and unsummoned the Dickon. As the creature faded away, the runes on his wrists grew cool, and a tingling, which he hadn't realized had been there the entire time he had the Dickon summoned, disappeared.
Now, how about we prepare our third floor while we wait for the research to finish?
James asked. They were 6 hours into the final day of immersion, meaning he had roughly 18 hours left. His research levels for Avatar, Core Defense, and Core Offense level 2 completions all had 18 hours remaining, meaning it would be pointless to use a dungeon token on them now, as he would still have to wait 6 more hours. He had tried quizzing Rue about what options the research would give him, and about Dungeon Wars in general, but it seemed any further information was gated until the research completed. That meant the logical step was to build his third floor.
Oh, dungeon building is always my favorite.
Rue grinned at him and cracked her knuckles.
Can I spin the wheel again?
You know you have a gambling problem.
James chuckled as he mentally closed the Avatar Training Grounds window, which removed him from his avatar's body and returned him to his floating orb. Immediately, he missed the body.
But I suppose I'll continue to enable that.
Chapter 7.
Greetings, old chap. To what do I owe the pleasure?
The Terminus was glancing up at James and Rue from within his lair. James had taken Rue down to their second-floor main instance in order to begin his dungeon ascension process. Ever since the first Terminus fight, James had known where he wanted the third-floor portal to be.
Mind if I put the third-floor portal in your lair?
Originally, James had planned to just put the portal there. However, given the intelligence of his second-floor boss mob, who seemed capable of beating Rue at multiple games, he figured he should at least ask the boss if it was all right. It was only proper, after all.
Not at all, good sir. In fact, I feel such a decision will lead to even more brash and foolish morsels appearing at my doorstep.
The Terminus let out a dark chuckle and began to rise within the lair, motioning to the very back.
I eagerly await their return. More delectable treats for me and additional experience for you. Why, 'tis a glorious plan indeed. Most agreeable.
James felt shivers run down his spine, and he was pretty sure the Terminus was trying to rub its hands together in a very old-school movie villain kind of way.
I appreciate that, Sir Rexus.
James selected his Dungeon Ascension tab and summoned the portal in the back of the lair.
And be prepared for the next time the adventurers arrive. I believe we may be receiving unwelcomed guests soon.
Ah, yes. Dungeon Wars.
The second-floor boss produced a toothy grin.
I do hope you will release me from the arena when the time comes. I can promise you, good sir, I will strike terror in your enemies, the likes of which they will never recover from, especially if my dear boy BLU is allowed to join me.
James nodded his orb towards the boss as he floated towards the third-floor portal. Of course, he didn't quite know how Dungeon Wars were going to work, but if he could unleash the perfect cognivore on the invading adventurers, well, that might just give him an upper hand. After all, even though Blank had hit Tier 3 before James, he highly doubted any adventurers would be close to the level needed to take down a level 50 secret boss. Of course, based on how Xander spoke of the duo, he was sure they had their own tricks prepared. But James was glad to know he could count on Sir Rexus.
I will definitely keep that in mind. I look forward to seeing the perfect cognivore once more in action.
Indeed, a wise choice.
Rexus let out a mixture of a growl and a purr, which caused the lair to shake softly. It was time to leave.
You're the best, Rexy.
Rue waved and winked at the boss before flying quickly ahead of James to the portal.
Have you decided on your starting landscape?
James had. He had been proactive with his downtime and had spent a lot, and he meant a lot, of time thinking about his third floor. Obviously, the mob type was undetermined, a fact he both loved and hated. However, even though mob choice was out of his control, terrain wasn't. Currently, his first floor was underground, yet for all intents and purposes, it was simply a massive farm. His players had access to all the various crops, plus the farm animals themselves for crafting purposes. He was also planning on putting in some additional mining locations within his first floor to help the local blacksmiths. He had come across various mineral options, and because of the demonic nature of the first floor, had found he was able to place infernal variants of the usual metals. His second floor, conversely, was a sparsely populated, expansive wasteland. Resource-wise, it offered up predominantly scrap metal, various springs, gears, and other post-apocalyptic type items. Not bad for some crafting jobs, and definitely helpful in various ways, especially the leather and precious metals that players could receive from the fallen steampunk dinos. That being said, the theme for his first two floors, even though their mobs were vastly different, was that they were both open expanses. He wanted to change that up, but was also hesitant to change it too much. Creating a floor in a winding cavern underground with multiple floors like a stereotypical dungeon just seemed dangerous given his mob type was not yet known. He also couldn't create a dungeon in a mountain range just yet because the resource cost of modifying such a landscape, especially if the mobs didn't suit it, wasn't worth it. So what James had decided upon was a marshland setting. It was, again, still a rather flat type of floor. However, the marshlands had large overgrown trees that made the area darker and more mysterious. It also had a wide variety of plant options that James could see as being used for potions and poisons for the adventurers. And because of the nature of swampy areas, James would have a lot of opportunities to play with various traps and environmental hazards. It seemed like a nice change of pace for his players that would keep them actively engaged. Unless, of course, he applied poison effects to the entire area. But he wouldn't do that. With that thought, he pulled up his floor options and selected the marshland. The moment he made his selection, he saw an instance tab appear for his third floor, the main instance for it. Of course, he and Rue could just instantly hop to the instance, but where would the fun be in that? Instead, he nodded towards the pixie, motioning towards the portal.
Ladies first.
The pixie, in proper Rue fashion, did a slight curtsy while sticking her tongue out at him and stepped through the portal. James quickly followed so that he wouldn't miss her reaction. He loved surprising the pixie and he was sure she would approve of his floor choice. And if she didn't, well, he would only have to listen to her complain about it until he got to the 4th floor, which would simply mean even more motivation to reach Tier 4. Huh, as if he needed more motivation. He loved this game. He loved constantly improving and gaining new mobs, skills, and research options. All of it. Even without his urge to show up that Dick Xander and the annoying duo Blank, James would be pushing himself to reach new heights in the game. In reality, all Blank and Xander had done to him was give him a boss fight of his own to overcome, and James loved winning boss fights. As he pushed through the portal, he felt his worry about Xander and Blank fade away. While he was still concerned about them, nothing could impact the here and now. The joy, the thrill of creating a new floor overcame him. And if he had to be honest, Xander aside, the thrill of battling against Blank was still there. If anything, his avatar creation and his interaction with the Terminus had just lit a fire in him. Fear was gone, replaced instead with anticipation. Worry and doubt could only get him so far. Now, he needed to embrace the moment and capture the now. As he finished the teleportation to the 3rd floor and his focus shifted to Rue as she excitedly zipped about the trees and marsh, he couldn't help but smile internally, almost feeling like thanking Xander and Blank for this moment. They'd pushed him to reach Tier 3 this immersion, and in doing so, given him this opportunity. It was time to meet his 3rd floor mobs. Chapter 8. It had taken longer than James expected for Rue to calm down enough to prepare to summon his 3rd floor mobs. The pixie had been awash with questions regarding his floor choice, and to his surprise, she actually seemed impressed.
You actually do put a lot more thought into this than I expected.
Rue nodded appraisingly at James. If he'd still been in his avatar, she would have seen him blush. She didn't give him compliments very often, and this, even if this one came across as slightly insulting, was still a compliment.
Well, one of us has to be the brains.
Of course, he wasn't going to respond in kind. It was only fair.
And that is definitely not you.
Rue stuck out her tongue at him and summoned a slice of pizza in front of him. James nearly winced from the hunger pangs.
I mean, you didn't even eat before you logged in. I've had to deal with hangry Glyax all week. Hey, that's not...
She silenced him with a hand as she took a slow bite of the pizza. James could still see steam rising from it. He made a mental note to see if he could summon food while he was in his avatar. He missed the taste of food, and immersion food always tasted so good. Rumor was, food within DCO actually tasted even better and more nuanced than it did in the zone. Another draw of the game, and another example of just how advanced it was.
So,
She said, between bites.
you gonna keep me waiting?
She winked at him as the pizza disappeared.
It's not nice to keep a lady waiting.
She leaned forward and pouted slightly.
Yeah, good thing you're not a lady.
Rue rocked backward, feigning pain, before she offered him a wicked grin.
No, I'm so much more. But you'll never know.
She winked as she said the final words and bit lightly at her lower lip.
And that's my cue.
He waved a tentacle, and his Tier 3 monster list appeared. As always, it was empty, save for the glowing words, "Generate random mob."
Good boy.
She blew him a kiss and selected the option. He had already spent a small number of resources to spread his influence over a patch of soggy, moss-covered ground in the middle of the marsh. As fine a place as any to summon his brand-new 3rd floor mobs. "Come on," he silently urged as he and Rue waited out the painful moments while RNGesus ran in the background. After what felt like an eternity, a form began to appear.
What the dickens is that?
James asked, confused. The first time he had ever summoned a mob, it had been a tiny demonic chicken. The 1-point cost, level 1 mob that started it all. The second time, it had been a 7-point mob for his 2nd floor, his Velocity Raptor. Both mobs had turned out to be terrifying, but from the looks of them and their sizes, they hadn't been impressive. The 3rd floor mob that had appeared before them had one thing going for it. It was massive, or at least he was pretty sure it was. Whatever it was before him seemed like a 20-foot, brightly colored traffic cone?
Oh, I know this one.
Rue's voice was tinged with mirth. James had spent enough time with her to know when she was fighting back laughter. She knew what this was, and she was about to break out in tears. That was never a good sign for him.
What?
James started to pull up the stat window on whatever the mob was before him, but even as he raised a tentacle, the traffic cone shape began to move. It unraveled slowly. Well, actually, it uncoiled, and James couldn't believe what he was looking at.
Is that a snake?
It looked goofy. It really did. As it uncoiled further, it did appear to be a giant snake. A giant serpent in a marshland totally worked, or at least it should have. However, his mind had finally processed what the giant snake was made out of. Why it was so colorful.
It is a snake, indeed. Though doesn't it appear to be a bit stuffed?
Rue started laughing before James could even groan. She was right. The massive, multicolored snake seemed to be made completely out of cloth. It was a stuffed snake, the type kids would have in their rooms. As it finished uncoiling and looked up at him, he could see its eyes were formed from a hard plastic, and as it opened its mouth, the tongue that sprang forward to lick his orb was made of felt. At least its fangs were made of the same hard, dark plastic as its eyes, so there was that.
All right, what's the mob type?
James was raging internally. Here he was with a damp, dark marshland for his floor, and his first mob was a neon stuffed snake. He hadn't even looked at its name yet. He needed to know how badly RNG had just stuffed animals. He stared hard at those words under the heading of Tier 3 mobs, doing his best to control himself. This was not what he wanted. This was not a mob type that he had envisioned for his third floor. All right, so demonic farm animals had been unlucky, but he had dealt with it. Steampunk dinosaurs had been cool, and he was lucky for that mob type. However, it seemed RNGesus could give as easily as it could take away, and it had just dealt him another blow. Stuffed animals in a marshland. His adventurers were going to get a massive laugh out of this.
So, what's this big guy's name?
Rue had started petting the blasted stuffed snake, which was snuggling up against her, flitting its tongue across her face like a puppy would. James let out a heavy sigh and motioned for her to come over as he set his focus on the mob. At least he had been correct. The mob before him was the strongest of the 5 he could summon on the Tier 3 floor.
That is a giant... Ugh.
James sighed. Plaython. He pulled up the detailed information on it as he said the name. Seriously? James had to wonder if Steve had been responsible for some of these random classes. The man had, after all, been a fan of toilet mimics. That twisted individual had to have been a part of the troll mob choices in the game. Giant Plaython, 15, level 33. Type, Stuffed Serpent. HP, 2100, 650 out of 650 fluff. MP, 350. Attack, 275. Defense, 275. Unique abilities. Adaptive patches. Giant Playthons can adjust the colors of their patchwork skin to blend in with any environment of their choice. Struggle Snuggles. Giant Playthons are constrictors. Giant Playthons can wrap their form around an adventurer, using its massive stuffed body to squeeze the adventurer. This attack does 1% of a player's max HP in damage per second. Sleepy. Giant Playthons are extremely soft to touch. Any enemy caught in Struggle Snuggles will begin gaining stacks of exhaustion per 5 seconds constrained. At 10 stacks, the player will fall asleep for 1 minute. Unique traits. Stuffed with fluff. Stuffed animals are made out of, well, stuffing. As such, they receive 40% less damage from magical attacks, 30% less damage from blunt attacks, 20% more damage from piercing attacks, 10% more damage from slashing attacks. Cutting a stuffed animal open will result in it losing additional stuffing, decreasing the effects of stuffed with fluff based on the amount of fluff that has been lost. Lost fluff will reduce maximum HP of mobs by 5% per 10% of maximum fluff lost. Alright, so James had to admit the Giant Plaython wasn't terrible. It was definitely a mob that James could see as serving a fun challenge for adventurers and was fitting of Tier 3 status. That being said, As James read through the rest of the list, he couldn't help but let out a groan. He was going to be the laughingstock dungeon again. From lowest to highest, the mobs were Jolly Dolly, 11, Teddy Knight, 12, Snuggle Wolf, 13, Funky Monkey, 14, Giant Plaython, 15. James took a deep breath before he hovered over the first one. He was going to need to mentally prepare himself for what was about to come. Chapter 9.
What you planning on doing with your new mobs?
Rue was hovering annoyingly over James's orb as he browsed the screens in front of him. He had opened up all of the mob's stats, looked over all of their skills, and left their screens up. However, from there he had frozen up. Was this really to be his third floor?
I don't know yet,
James said sternly. He kept glancing across them all and then down at his marshlands. He had already dismissed the first giant plaython, leaving the marshland dead and desolate, which was partly how he was feeling currently. Damn RNG.
Well, you've got 800 mob points to spend.
Rue seemed extremely amused with his mobs, and while part of James did find them funny, he didn't really need funny right now. He was hoping for something cool and dangerous, not freaking stuffed animals.
800, yeah, I know.
I can read.
Oh, can you?
Rue leaned over his orb and pulled up a timer in front of him. The clock was slowly ticking down. 15 hours, 47 minutes, 12 seconds remaining till immersion ended. 15 hours left, if he didn't choose to sleep, to set up his third floor and get prepared for whatever Blank was going to throw his way in Dungeon Wars. From what Rue had found in the notes she'd been given access to, there was a good chance Dungeon Wars would start as early as next immersion. James sorely wanted more information as to what that would entail, but Rue seemed unable to provide more information for now. So preparing his third floor was the best use of his limited time. For a moment, the pressure of everything started to push away his previous excitement. For a moment, his doubt returned. He needed to not only set up his floor in a way that would work for these unique mobs, but also a way that would keep him competitive. Plus, a way that would still draw in adventurers. On top of that, he still had to see what the boss mob situation would be for the floor and look into his research options. He already knew when his research hit 12 hours, he would be using a dungeon token on all 3 options in order to see what level 2 of each option gave him, so he could have some in-game time to play around with those. He still needed to figure out what core offense and core defense research even did.
Why are you stalling?
Rue's words, along with the timer, pulled him out of his stupor and into a hangry rage.
Maybe because this whole situation is bullshit.
James really wasn't one to lose his cool. He prided himself on that fact. But between everything that had been going on, from Dwight knocking him unconscious, to dealing with Xander, the threat from Blank, the hunger pangs he had been dealing with for 7 days straight in immersion, and now freaking stuffed animals for his mobs, he'd finally lost it.
First, I'm constantly bullied in the real world. Second, the world I usually escape to has now become a responsibility. I'm responsible for the entire freaking world everyone in my town is playing in right now. Don't you think that is a bit much?
James spun around, tentacles flailing as he glared at Rue.
Then, just as everything in that game is settling and I am getting into a groove and having fun, the lead developer decides he has a personal problem with me and puts even more restrictions and threats on me.
Rue was staring at him. He could tell she wanted to speak, but he had caught her off guard.
Add into that his spoiled, shitty children deciding they don't like me because I somehow, not even by my own choice, got an advantage in the game. So now they want to destroy me.
James took a deep breath.
And then, when I get to my third floor, when I think I've got everything figured out, when I'm in a great freaking mood because we get to build a brand new floor,
James pointed a tentacle at one of the screens, summoning a mob.
I get stuck with stuffed freaking animals.
The mob he had summoned mid-rant appeared before them, standing gingerly atop the simple plot of land. It was one of those eerie stuffed toy dolls that little children played with. It even had a pull string coming out the back to make it talk. The doll stood silently, staring out with blank, lifeless doll eyes at the surrounding area.
What the hell am I even supposed to do with that?
Rue didn't say a word. The pixie looked down at the doll, and then back to James. Silently, she glided towards him, growing slightly larger as she did. The moment she reached his orb, she wrapped him in an embrace, continuing to remain quiet as she gently began to stroke the top of his orb. For a moment, rage flashed through him, fueled not only by his hunger, but by his frustrations and the whole bullshit of the situation before him. He raised his tentacles to push the pixie away, but faltered.
You know, James,
She whispered, using his real name for once.
before you, my world was darkness. Since you started DCO, everything has gotten so much better. I have a purpose. You gave me a purpose.
His tentacles wavered and fell to his side as she continued.
I've seen you overcome so much. I've seen everything you've done, and I believe in what you can do going forward. Sure, things aren't great right now, but if there's one thing I've come to realize about you, it's that you can accomplish so much more than you think. You may not hear this often, James, but you've got so much potential, and
Her voice became even quieter as emotion overtook her.
you're not alone in this. I'm here with you, and I'll help you out no matter what. I'll never leave your side.
Emotion rushed through James. Grief, frustration, anger, exhaustion. He couldn't speak. He didn't have the words to express what he was feeling. Honestly, he had never let his emotions break out like this. He always kept them close to his heart. He needed to always seem okay, so that his parents wouldn't feel the need to leave their work and care for him. He was strong. He was independent. But right then, he realized that even so, he still needed someone else in his life. Someone else to help share his burdens. Was that why his parents insisted he be paired with Rue? Were he and Rue meant to help and support each other? Was this a way for his parents to be there for him when they couldn't normally? It was too much. His voice broke as he fought against himself. It cracked, and he knew that if he had been in human form, he would have been bawling his eyes out.
I'm so sorry, Rue.
The pixie pushed his orb slowly away from herself and offered James a smile.
For what? You haven't done anything wrong, dummy.
James instinctively used a tentacle to wipe away a non-existent tear and looked up at the pixie. She was always so immature, so frustrated. Hell, most of the time she was a drunk. But he could tell there was a completely different side to her. A side that really cared. A side that was calm, gentle, and supportive. How had he missed that before?
Thank you.
James whispered, turning back to his mob, which was still standing there, glancing around.
But seriously, what are we going to do?
As he spoke, regaining his composure, the mob, a jolly dolly, looked up at James and Rue. The doll grabbed at its string behind its back and tugged at it.
Come play with me.
The voice was that of a small girl, perhaps 5 years old. Sure, it may have been cute in a regular setting, but hearing that voice in a dark, empty marshland sent shivers down James's spine. With that, a thought surfaced in his mind. Or maybe it had always been there, but his frustrations had pushed it aside. Maybe, just maybe, he could make this work.
I would say it is time for you to touch upon your inner Stephen King.
Rue said. The pixie shot a look between James and the creepy dolly.
Or R.L. Stein, your choice.
I think I may be able to do just that, he replied thoughtfully. Both were well known to James. How couldn't they be? The Stephen King stories were still being turned into movies, and there were even survival games in immersion based around his books. James had never been more scared in his life than the time when he had decided to try the Shining experience as part of an online challenge. And of course, R.L. Stein's Goosebumps had their own creepy and wacky universes in immersion. Between his exposure to both, he figured he could make this work, especially if he added in some of the newer online horror twists he had seen played out. And as he eyed the lineup once more, perhaps he could even give homage to McStuffin. Now that his mental block was gone, his excitement returned tenfold. This was going to be good. Chapter 10. Now that James had gotten over his mental breakdown, it was time to get to work. He reabsorbed the surprisingly hopeful Jolly Dolly and prepared for what he needed to do. The first step to building his third floor was spreading his influence. He currently had 1,812 resources to use, out of a total of 4,900. He had used 1,800 resources the last time, on his second floor, to make a 900 by 900 yard expanse. If he wanted to continue growing the dungeon, well, he needed to make this floor even larger.
Should I double the size of the second floor?
He had, after all, doubled the size of his first floor when he designed the layout of his second floor. His first floor was 450 by 450, his second was 900 by 900, so should his third be 1,800 by 1,800? It was simple math, but James knew doing just that would quickly make his dungeon skyrocket in size, and he was pretty sure he couldn't keep up with those resource costs.
Do you really need it to be that large?
Rue was glancing at the expanse that went on all around them. From what James had found of these pre-generated floors, they would go on infinitely if he had the resources to continue spreading his influence. If he got to the current edge, it just auto-generated more of the same environment. And when he finalized the instance, the space created invisible boundaries which kept both mobs and players confined in the area. James, now back in a good mood, couldn't let the pixie's phrasing go unnoticed.
Oh, are you implying size doesn't matter?
The pixie shot him a devilish grin.
I'm just saying, bigger doesn't instantly mean better.
She moved closer to him as she spoke.
It all depends on how you use it.
She gave him a quick, playful squeeze on his tentacle and flew away laughing.
Don't get too worked up, Glyax. I'm not that into tentacle monsters.
She flashed her wicked smile and wink.
But I'll give you a moment to cool off. I'm sure I can find a way to entertain myself while I wait.
And with that, she was gone. James took a few deep breaths, doing all he could to calm himself. His current form really was a blessing and a curse. Sure, it was great she couldn't see his facial expressions or physical tells when it came to nervousness, embarrassment, etc. But seriously, a floating tentacle monster? Whoever the hell came up with this had some explaining to do. He also wondered if this was the only form dungeon cores could take, or if Xander, being Xander, had just assigned it to James. Because honestly, floating tentacle monster was just plain dumb. And now that James knew he could get an avatar, he didn't understand why he couldn't just float about in his avatar state, especially considering no one else could see him anyway. He grumbled a bit more to himself about Xander and how the developer was just a petty creep, and then turned back to the task at hand. The more he thought on it, the more he liked the plan he was formulating, and luckily for him, he once again had a decent amount of dungeon tokens to play with for his floor development. First, James decided to be economical and utilize all of his current resources. Rue was right, he didn't need to double the size of his floor. In fact, he didn't need to increase the size of this floor just yet. He could always do so at a later time. As such, he decided to use his 1,800 resources and simply create a 900 by 900 square yard expanse like he had last time. Given the fact that everything was marshlands, it actually made the size seem irrelevant. No one could really tell how large a marsh was when they were in the middle of it, surrounded by swamp, trees, and monsters. With that done, James was able to get to work. He popped a dungeon token and filled his resources back up to 4,900. Given some inspiration, James finally had a plan for all of his mobs and a vision on how to best utilize the swampy area to make it work. Starting with his lowest cost mob, James began to build small huts and pathways within the trees of the marshland. Small structures and the creaking wooden bridges James was making normally were rather low cost. In fact, connect essentially the entire canopy of the trees in some way or another with these huts and pathways. The reason for this was to utilize the Jolly Dollies in probably the creepiest, most effective way possible. Their voices and visage in this setting already seemed like something out of a Stephen King novel. Combined with that, the fact that James knew there was an old, supposedly haunted island of dolls in the region